I was halfway through brushing my hair when I noticed the stranger in the photo. The picture was one I'd seen 1,000 times, tucked into the corner of my dresser mirror. It showed me, my parents, and my younger brother, Eric, on a family trip to the lake. It was taken years ago, before everything fell apart, before the fights, the distance, and the silence. In the picture, we're standing by the water, arms slung around each other, smiling so wide you'd think nothing in the world could ever go wrong. Except now, someone else was there. A man stood in the background, just barely visible over my dad's shoulder. He was tall and thin, dressed in a dark coat that looked out of place for a summer day. His face was blurry, like the camera hadn't focused on him, but his eyes seemed sharp, even through the distortion. I stared at the photo for a long time, trying to remember if he'd always been there. Maybe I'd never noticed him before. Or maybe it was a trick of the light, just some random stranger who happened to walk into the frame. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that crept over me. That night, I pulled out the old photo album, flipping through it with trembling hands. Page after page of smiling faces, birthdays, holidays, vacations. And then I found him again, the man in the dark coat. This time, he was standing at the edge of a photo taken on Christmas morning, half hidden behind the living room curtains. His posture was stiff, unnatural, as though he wasn't supposed to be there. "Okay," I whispered, trying to steady my breathing. "This is just some weird coincidence. That's all." But when I found him in a third photo, a picture of Eric's 6th birthday party, standing among the children with an expression that might have been a smile, I knew it wasn't a coincidence. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his blurry face, those sharp, too focused eyes. The next morning, I called my mom. "Hey, do you remember the guy in the lake photo?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "What guy?" I explained, describing him as best as I could. She laughed softly, but there was a nervous edge to it. "Honey, I don't know what you're talking about. There wasn't anyone else there." I hung up feeling worse than before. Over the next few days, the man started appearing in places he shouldn't. One afternoon, I found a shadowy outline in the reflection of my living room window. At first, I thought it was just a tree outside, but when I stepped closer, the shape moved. It shifted, leaning closer to the glass, and for a brief, heart-stopping moment, I thought I saw the faint glint of those sharp eyes. I tore down every photo in my apartment that night, stuffing them into a box and shoving it into the back of my closet. But it didn't help. He was still there. I'd catch glimpses of him out of the corner of my eye, in the mirror, in the TV screen when it was turned off, in the darkened windows of passing cars. He was always just far enough away to make me doubt myself, but close enough to keep my heart racing. I started avoiding my own reflection. The mirrors in my apartment were covered with blankets, and I kept the lights low, hoping it would make him harder to see. But it didn't stop him. One night, I woke up to a faint tapping sound. It was soft, almost rhythmic, and it took me a moment to realize it was coming from the dresser mirror. I'd forgotten to cover that one. The tapping stopped as soon as I turned my head, but the unease lingered. My reflection stared back at me, pale and wide-eyed, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement behind it. A shadow, too tall and too thin, shifted just out of frame. I threw a blanket over the mirror and crawled back into bed, pulling the covers over my head like a terrified child. The next morning, there was a photo sitting on my nightstand. It wasn't one of mine. The picture showed my bedroom, taken from a low angle, like someone had been crouching in the corner. The bed was unmade, the blanket draped over the dresser mirror, and there I was, curled up beneath the covers, fast asleep. In the photo, the man in the dark coat stood at the foot of my bed. I tried to call my mom again, but the call wouldn't go through. My phone screen flickered, the signal cutting out every time I dialed her number. And then the text came. "Why are you hiding?" I dropped the phone, my hands shaking. I wanted to run, to get out of the apartment, but every instinct screamed at me to stay put. I didn't know where he was, but I knew he'd follow me if I left. That night, I stayed awake, clutching a flashlight and a kitchen knife. The air in the apartment felt heavy, oppressive, like I was being watched from every angle. I didn't see him again until just before dawn. The tapping started again, this time louder, more insistent. When I finally summoned the courage to pull the blanket off the mirror, he was there, standing just behind my reflection. He wasn't blurry anymore. His face was pale and gaunt, his eyes sharp and hungry, like he was studying me. His mouth twitched into something that might have been a smile, but it was wrong. Too wide, too sharp, too eager. I don't know how long we stared at each other, but when I blinked, he was gone. The photo on the nightstand was gone too. I haven't seen him since that night, but I feel him. He's in the silence, in the corners of my vision, waiting for me to slip up. I've stopped looking at photos. I've stopped looking in mirrors. But every so often, I'll catch a glimpse of movement in a dark window, and I know he's still watching. It all began when I moved into the house on Elmwood Drive. I didn't plan to stay long. It was just a rental while I figured things out after my divorce. The house was small, plain, and unremarkable, except for one thing: the attic door. I didn't notice it when I first toured the place. The ceiling in the hallway had one of those pull-down ladder setups, but the landlord never mentioned it, and I didn't think to ask. On move-in day, as I was lugging boxes inside, I looked up and saw the faint outline of the trapdoor. The edges were smudged with dirt, like someone had tried to force it open with their fingers. That should have been my first warning. The attic door stayed shut for the first few weeks. I kept telling myself I'd check it out eventually, but I never worked up the nerve. It wasn't that I was scared, exactly. I just didn't like the way it made me feel. Every time I walked under it, I got this heavy, sinking sensation in my chest, like I was walking into deep water. Maisie, my dog, avoided the hallway entirely, and when she had to pass through, she'd lower her head and skitter across the floor like something might reach down and grab her. The first strange thing happened about a month after I moved in. I was sitting on the couch late at night, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a soft thump overhead. I froze. Maisie's ears perked up, and she let out a low growl, staring at the hallway. It's just the house settling, I told myself. Old houses make weird noises. But then it came again, louder this time, like someone was dropping something heavy onto the floor above me. My skin crawled. There was no one else in the house, and I knew for a fact I hadn't gone into the attic. I didn't even have the pull cord to open the ladder. The noise stopped after a few minutes, and I convinced myself it was just a raccoon or a squirrel. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I decided to investigate. I borrowed a stepladder from my neighbor, climbed up, and pushed the trapdoor open. Dust rained down onto my face, and I coughed as I hoisted myself into the attic. The space was small and cramped, the kind of attic where you can't stand up straight. The only light came from a single bulb hanging from the rafters, which cast long, flickering shadows across the room. Most of it was empty, but in the far corner, I saw something strange. It was a dollhouse. It sat on the floor, surrounded by a layer of dust so thick it looked like snow. The dollhouse was old, made of faded wood with peeling paint and tiny, broken shutters. But what struck me was how detailed it was. It wasn't just any dollhouse. It was a perfect replica of the house I was standing in. Every detail was identical, down to the missing shingle on the roof and the crack in the living room window. Inside, the miniature rooms were fully furnished with tiny chairs, tables, and beds. There were even little figurines, posed as if they were going about their lives. I bent down to get a closer look, and my breath caught in my throat. One of the figurines looked exactly like me. It was standing in the living room of the dollhouse, holding a tiny phone in its hand, its face turned toward the couch. The detail was uncanny. Same haircut, same clothes I'd been wearing the night before. And sitting on the floor next to it was a tiny dog that looked just like Maisie. I reached out to touch it, but the moment my fingers brushed against the dollhouse, I felt a sudden, sharp pain in my chest, like a needle had been driven straight into my heart. I yanked my hand back, gasping, and stumbled out of the attic. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired and stressed. But over the next few days, things got worse. Every night, I'd hear noises from the attic, footsteps, scratching, and sometimes faint whispers that I couldn't quite make out. Maisie started growling at the ceiling, her hackles raised, and no amount of comforting could calm her down. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight, climbed back into the attic, and shined the beam toward the dollhouse. The figure of me was no longer in the living room. It was standing in the attic now, facing the trapdoor. I screamed and scrambled back down the ladder, slamming the trapdoor shut behind me. But when I turned around, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The figure from the dollhouse was standing in my hallway. It wasn't a doll anymore. It was full-sized, its face an exact replica of mine, but its skin was pale and waxy, its movements stiff and unnatural. It tilted its head, mimicking me perfectly, and smiled. I don't remember much after that. I ran out of the house, Maisie barking at my heels, and drove to a motel on the other side of town. I left everything behind, my clothes, my furniture, my phone. I don't know what that thing was, or why it came after me. All I know is that I'm not going back. Sometimes, though, I wake up in the middle of the night and think I hear it. Those same soft footsteps, those same faint whispers. And I wonder if it's found me again. I was cleaning out my late grandfather's attic, a job I'd put off for weeks because, honestly, the place was a mess. Dust blanketed every surface, boxes were stacked haphazardly, and the air smelled faintly of mothballs and wood rot. I was halfway through sorting a box of old tools when I spotted it. A small, battered envelope tucked into the corner of a trunk. Inside was a single photograph. It was black and white, slightly faded, but still clear enough to make out the details. The image showed a group of people standing in front of an old house. At first glance, it looked like one of those old family reunion photos. Men in suits, women in dresses, kids sitting cross-legged on the ground. Except for the man in the back. He was taller than anyone else, his head almost grazing the edge of the photograph. He wore a dark coat that seemed to shimmer oddly, as though it had been made of something other than fabric. His face was obscured by shadow, despite the fact that the rest of the group was clearly lit, and his hands, too long, with fingers that stretched unnaturally, rested on the shoulders of the two people standing in front of him. I turned the photo over. On the back, written in shaky, faded handwriting, was a single line. "He follows when you see him." I shoved the photo back into the envelope and tried to convince myself it was just some creepy old prank. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The way the man's shadowy face seemed to pull at my attention, the strange tension in the group's poses, like they were trying to look normal while hiding something. The next morning, I found the photo on my nightstand. I hadn't put it there. I stared at it, my stomach twisting. The image was the same, but something was different. The man in the back was still there, but his head was turned now, tilted ever so slightly as if looking at me. I stuffed the photo into a drawer and told myself to forget about it. But I couldn't. Strange things started happening. My phone would buzz with notifications, but when I checked, there were no messages. I'd hear faint knocking at my door, but no one would be there. Objects around my apartment seemed to move on their own. A chair slightly out of place, a mug on the counter instead of the sink. Then came the footsteps. They started faint, just a soft tapping outside my window late at night. But they grew louder, closer, until I could hear them in the hallway outside my apartment. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the photo from the drawer and marched to the trash chute in the hallway. I dropped the envelope in and listened as it clattered down to the bottom. When I got back to my apartment, the photo was waiting for me on the kitchen table. The man's face was closer now. The shadows that had obscured it before were thinner, more transparent. I could almost make out the shape of his features, deep-set eyes, a sharp nose, a mouth that seemed too wide. I started seeing him everywhere. At the grocery store, standing at the end of an aisle. On the subway, sitting 3 rows behind me. In the reflections of windows as I walked past them. Always just far enough away that I couldn't reach him, couldn't confront him. But he was getting closer. I turned to the internet for answers, posting the photo in obscure forums, asking if anyone had seen something similar. Most people thought it was fake, some kind of Photoshop trick, but one user sent me a private message. "You need to burn it," they wrote. "It's the only way to break the connection. But do it fast. The longer you wait, the harder it is." I didn't need to be told twice. I took the photo to the sink, lit a match, and held it to the corner. The flame caught quickly, curling the edges and sending wisps of black smoke into the air. For a brief moment, I felt relief, like I'd finally taken control. Then the fire went out. The photograph was untouched. The knocking at my door started again, louder this time, more insistent. I backed away, clutching the photo, my heart pounding. The knocking turned to banging, and the doorknob rattled violently. I screamed, "What do you want?" The banging stopped. Silence hung in the air for what felt like an eternity. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice whispered, "Let me in." I don't remember unlocking the door. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the hallway outside my apartment. The door was open behind me, the lights flickering inside, and the photo was gone. The knocking has stopped, but now, when I catch my reflection in mirrors or windows, I see him standing just behind me, waiting. I'd been living in my new apartment for about 2 weeks when I first heard it. A faint humming noise, low and rhythmic, coming from somewhere behind the walls. It wasn't constant. It would start late at night, around 11 p.m., and fade away by the time the sun came up. At first, I thought it was the pipes or maybe an electrical issue. Old buildings make noise, right? I tried to ignore it, but the humming got louder. By the third night, it was impossible to sleep. The sound wasn't just a hum anymore. It had a pattern, a rise and fall like breathing. It seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat, making the walls feel alive. I banged on them a few times, shouting for whoever might be making the noise to stop. The sound paused for a moment, then started up again, louder and more insistent. I called my landlord the next day. "It's probably just the heating system," she said, her tone dismissive. "These old places can be temperamental. I'll have someone check it out." No one came. That night, the humming didn't just stay in the walls. I woke up around 2 a.m. to find it reverberating through the floor, a deep, resonant vibration that made my teeth ache. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and realized the sound wasn't coming from any one direction anymore. It was all around me, and then it stopped. The silence was worse. I sat there in the dark, straining to hear anything. The usual creaks of the building, the distant hum of traffic, but there was nothing. Just an oppressive stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. That's when I heard the knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it came from inside the apartment. I froze, my eyes darting toward the bedroom door. The knock came again, a little louder this time, followed by a faint scraping noise, like nails dragging across wood. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, but the call wouldn't go through. The screen flickered, then went black. The knocking stopped. For a long time, I didn't move. My breath came in shallow gasps, and I could feel sweat trickling down my spine. Then, slowly, I got out of bed and crept toward the door. The scraping sound had shifted. It was coming from the other side of the living room now, near the wall where the humming had been the loudest. I flipped on the light. The living room was empty, but the wall was different. The paint was peeling in long, jagged strips, and the plaster underneath was cracked, exposing something dark and wet. The humming started again, faint but growing, and the cracks in the wall seemed to pulse in time with it. I don't know what possessed me to touch it, but I did. The moment my fingers brushed the wall, the humming stopped, replaced by a voice, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from inside my head. "It's open," it said. The wall caved in, not like plaster breaking, more like it melted, the surface rippling and folding in on itself until there was a hole about the size of a door. Beyond it was darkness, deeper than any I'd ever seen. My flashlight barely pierced it. The beam swallowed up after a few feet. The air that seeped out was cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic smell. Then I saw the movement. It was subtle at first, just a flicker in the dark, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized something was shifting on the other side. Shapes writhed and undulated, their outlines impossible to define, like smoke trapped in water. They didn't seem to have any solid form, but they moved with intent, flowing toward the hole. The whispering started again, louder this time. Overlapping voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. My chest felt tight, and I stumbled backward, my legs threatening to give out. I should have run. Instead, I watched as one of the shapes emerged from the hole. It was tall and thin, its body twisting and unfolding like paper burned in reverse. Its face, if you could call it that, was smooth and featureless, but I could feel its gaze on me, heavy and invasive. It raised one long, spindly arm, pointing at me. "You brought us here," it said, the voice reverberating through the room. I shook my head, stammering, "No, I didn't. You opened the way." The shape stepped closer, its form distorting with every movement. The humming had returned, louder than ever, making the floor shake and the lights flicker. More shapes were spilling through the hole now, their bodies writhing and blending together like liquid shadows. I ran. I don't remember much after that. I know I made it out of the apartment, down the stairs, and into the street. When I turned back, the building was dark and silent, as if nothing had happened. I stood there, gasping for air, waiting for someone to come out. Another tenant, the landlord, anyone. But the building remained lifeless. The next day, I went back with a friend. The apartment was empty. My things were gone, the walls pristine, and the landlord swore I'd never rented from her. The humming is still with me. I hear it at night, faint and distant, no matter where I go. Sometimes, I think I see the shapes in the corners of my vision, watching, waiting. I don't think I escaped. I think I brought them with me. I first noticed the light on a Thursday night. It was late, just past midnight, and I was sitting at my desk in my small apartment, trying to finish a project for work. My window faced a quiet alley, the kind of place where even stray cats didn't bother to linger. The only light came from the glow of my laptop and the faint orange haze of a distant street lamp filtering through the blinds. That's why it caught my eye, this tiny, flickering light. It was faint, almost like the glow of a firefly, hovering just outside the window. At first, I thought it was a reflection, maybe from my laptop screen, but when I leaned closer, I realized it was coming from inside the alley. I pulled the blinds open and peered outside. There it was, floating about 10 feet off the ground, a soft, pulsing orb of light, like a star had drifted down and gotten lost. I stared at it, confused. It wasn't a drone or a flashlight or anything else that made sense. It was just hovering there, silent and steady. And then, as if it noticed me watching, it began to move. Slowly, it floated further down the alley, its soft glow bouncing off the brick walls. I don't know why I followed it. I grabbed my coat, slipped on my shoes, and stepped outside into the cold night air. The alley was quiet, the only sound my footsteps crunching on scattered gravel. The light drifted ahead, bobbing gently, leading me deeper into the darkness. At some point, I realized I wasn't in my alley anymore. The brick walls had given way to something older. Stone, weathered and cracked, covered in twisting vines. The air smelled damp, and the ground beneath me felt uneven, like I was walking on ancient cobblestones. I stopped, suddenly uneasy. Where am I? I whispered to myself, but the sound felt swallowed by the night. The light paused ahead of me, flickering softly, almost expectantly. Against every shred of common sense, I took another step toward it. And that's when I heard the sound. It was faint at first, like a distant hum, but it grew louder with each step I took. It wasn't mechanical, though. It was human. A voice, low and melodic, humming a song I didn't recognize. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. The humming stopped. The light blinked once, twice, and then darted forward, vanishing around a corner. I hesitated, torn between the urge to turn back and the pull of whatever was happening. I followed. The alley opened into a courtyard, bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. In the center stood a massive tree, its gnarled branches twisting upward like skeletal fingers. The light was there, circling the tree lazily, its glow reflecting off something shiny nestled in the roots. I stepped closer, my breath visible in the chill night air. The shiny object was a mirror, small and ornate, its silver frame etched with strange symbols. The moment I touched it, the world changed. The courtyard dissolved, replaced by a vast, endless expanse of darkness. I was standing on something solid, but it was invisible, like glass stretched over a void. Above me, countless lights flickered, tiny stars, each one pulsing faintly, as if alive. And then, one by one, they began to move. The stars drifted closer, forming shapes, faces. I saw people, dozens, hundreds, each one glowing faintly, their eyes wide and empty. They stared at me, their mouths moving silently, as if trying to speak but unable to make a sound. I stumbled back, clutching the mirror. What is this?" A voice answered, soft and echoing, as if it came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You see them, don't you?" I spun around, but there was no one there. "The lost ones," the voice continued. "They found the light, just as you did. What do you want?" I shouted, my voice cracking. The stars flickered, their glow dimming. "To join us," the voice said. The mirror in my hands began to pulse, its surface rippling like water. I tried to drop it, but my fingers wouldn't obey. The light, the original light, appeared again, circling me now, faster and faster, until I felt like I was being drawn into it. "No!" I screamed, fighting against the pull. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I was back in my apartment, standing in the middle of my living room. The mirror was gone, and so was the light. I thought it was over, but now, every night, I see them. In the dark corners of my apartment, in the reflection of my windows, in the faces of strangers on the street. The glowing people, their mouths moving silently, their empty eyes locked on me. I know what they want. They're waiting for me to follow again, and I don't think I can resist much longer. I hadn't been to the public library in years, but that night, it felt like the right place to go. It had been a bad day. Work sucked. My phone was full of unanswered texts from people who wanted too much from me, and I was sick of staring at screens. I wanted something quiet, something old, something that didn't need me to click or swipe or scroll. The library was nearly empty when I arrived, its fluorescent lights flickering faintly in the corners. The librarian at the desk, an older woman with sharp glasses and a sharper frown, gave me a curt nod as I wandered past. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I drifted through the aisles, letting my fingers graze the spines of dusty books. Some titles I recognized, others were in languages I couldn't read, and some had no titles at all. That's when I found it. It was sitting on a table in the back corner of the library, where the lights were dimmer, almost non-existent. A single book, bound in faded black leather, with no title or markings on the cover. It was smaller than most of the other books around it, and something about it drew me in. I shouldn't have opened it. The first page was blank, as was the second. But on the third page, I saw writing. Small, cramped handwriting in ink so dark it seemed to drink the light. "This book belongs to you now." I blinked, confused. The handwriting looked eerily familiar, like my own, but I'd never written anything like this before. I flipped to the next page. "You must not leave until you finish." I looked around the library, half expecting someone to pop out and tell me it was some kind of joke. But the aisles were empty, the silence pressing against my ears like a weight. I turned the page again. This time, there was a date written at the top, today's date. Below it was a short paragraph. "At 7:43 p.m., the man in the gray coat will ask for help finding a book. You must not answer him." I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was 7:40. A cold chill ran down my spine. The library was empty, wasn't it? No one had been here except me and the librarian. I stood up, shoving the book under my arm, and began walking toward the front desk. But before I got more than a few steps, I heard it. "Excuse me." The voice was soft, polite, and it came from behind me. I turned slowly. A man stood at the end of the aisle, wearing a gray coat that hung just a little too loosely on his thin frame. His face was pale, his eyes sunken, and his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Can you help me find something?" he asked. My heart was pounding. The book's words echoed in my head. "You must not answer him." "I'm not sure," I stammered, gripping the book tighter. The man tilted his head, his smile widening unnaturally. "You're holding it, you know." "What?" "The book," he said, pointing at it. "It belongs to me." I shook my head, taking a step back. I don't think so." His smile vanished. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said, his voice low and flat. The lights overhead flickered, and for a split second, his shadow stretched impossibly long across the floor, curling around the edges of the shelves. I bolted. The librarian didn't look up as I sprinted past her desk. I burst through the library's front doors, the book still clutched in my hands, and didn't stop running until I was halfway home. When I finally got inside, I locked every door and window, drew the curtains, and sat down to catch my breath. The book was still with me, its black cover somehow colder to the touch than it had been before. I should have thrown it away, burned it, done anything but open it again. But I did. The next page had more writing, the ink glistening like it was still wet. You broke the first rule. He knows where you live now. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the pipes, felt like something moving closer. When I woke up the next morning, the book was on my nightstand. I don't remember putting it there. A new page was written. You have 3 days to return it, or it will claim you. Claim me? What did that mean? And return it where? The library? I went back that afternoon, desperate for answers. The librarian was gone, replaced by a younger man with dark circles under his eyes. "Excuse me," I said, holding up the book. "I need to return this." He glanced at it, his expression unreadable. "We don't have that book." "What do you mean?" "I found it here yesterday." He shook his head. "It's not ours." Frustrated, I left, the book feeling heavier in my hands than it had before. The pages keep changing now, even as I write this. New words appear every time I look. Time is running out. He's already inside. I can hear footsteps in the hallway, soft and deliberate. The last message appeared just now, scrawled across the entire page in jagged letters. The book belongs to him, and so do you. The footsteps have stopped. Someone's knocking at the door. It started with the smell. Something faint at first, like burnt sugar. I noticed it as I walked into my apartment after work one evening, setting my bag down by the door. I sniffed the air and frowned. My kitchen was spotless. I hadn't cooked in days. Yet, the smell lingered, just on the edge of my senses. Sweet and acrid, wrong in a way I couldn't describe. The second thing I noticed was the clock. The old analog clock above my TV, with its steady tick-tock that always lulled me to sleep. That night, it didn't tick. The hands were frozen at 8:03, the second hand trembling ever so slightly, like it was fighting to move forward but couldn't. I stared at it for a moment, half expecting it to lurch back to life. When it didn't, I pulled it off the wall to check the battery. It was fine, brand new, even. I set the clock face down on the table, unease settling in my chest like a weight. That was when I noticed my reflection. In the darkened screen of the TV, I could see myself standing there. Only, I wasn't standing still. My reflection moved its hand to the back of its neck and scratched, something I hadn't done. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The reflection stopped moving, staring back at me with wide, unblinking eyes. Then it smiled. I stumbled backward, knocking over the lamp. The crash shattered the silence, and when I looked again, the screen was empty. Just my living room, my furniture, and me. My hands were trembling as I turned the TV on, desperate for the distraction of noise. Static greeted me instead of my usual channel. The static hissed, growing louder, until a voice broke through. "Do you see it yet?" I slammed the TV off. My reflection didn't reappear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next day, the glitches multiplied. My phone alarm didn't go off, yet when I picked it up, it said I'd snoozed it 5 times. I couldn't remember doing that. At work, my computer screen flickered, showing images of places I didn't recognize. Fields of flowers under a blood-red sky, a city with spires made of glass. Every time I tried to capture one of the images, it vanished, replaced by my spreadsheet. In the afternoon, I saw her. A woman standing across the street as I waited at the bus stop. She wore a green dress and a wide-brimmed hat, her face obscured by shadows. Her posture was unnervingly still, her head tilted slightly to one side as if she were studying me. I glanced at my phone to check the time, and when I looked up, she was gone. The bus arrived, and I tried to shake the feeling that she had been watching me. When I got home, my apartment felt different. It wasn't the furniture. Everything was in the same place. But the air was heavier, colder, like I'd walked into a room that had been sealed for decades. The faint smell of burnt sugar was back, stronger this time. I locked the door behind me, checked the windows, even the closets, but nothing was out of place. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that something had shifted. That night, I woke to a low, rhythmic humming. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with every passing second. I followed the sound to the living room, where the analog clock was back on the wall, its hands spinning wildly. The hum grew into words. "Time is slipping," the clock said. "The cracks are opening." My legs felt like lead, but I couldn't look away. The clock's hands stopped abruptly at midnight. The silence that followed was suffocating. Then the knock came. 3 slow, deliberate knocks from my front door. I didn't answer. I couldn't. My body refused to move. The knocks came again, louder this time. "Open it," said a voice from the other side. It was calm, low, and impossibly familiar. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. The door rattled, the knob twisting as if someone were trying to force it open. My chest tightened, panic clawing at my throat. The rattling stopped, and for a brief moment, everything was still. Then the voice came again. "You can't stay here." The door creaked open, though I hadn't unlocked it. On the other side wasn't my hallway, but a vast expanse of black, dotted with flickering lights that shimmered like stars. The air was cold, sharp, and electric. A figure stood just beyond the threshold, its shape impossible to define. It shifted constantly, its edges blurring, like static in human form. "You're slipping through," it said, its voice echoing inside my skull. "You've been marked." "For what?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "To hold the seam," it replied. "To keep the threads from unraveling." I tried to back away, but the air pulled at me, dragging me closer to the door. The figure raised an arm, or something like an arm, and pointed past me. I turned, and my breath caught in my throat. The reflection from the TV was standing behind me. Its smile stretched unnaturally wide. Its eyes burned like dying embers. "She's been waiting," the static figure said. "You don't belong here anymore." The reflection lunged, and the world dissolved into light. When I woke, I was somewhere else. The air was warm and shimmering. The ground beneath me a strange, glass-like surface that rippled under my weight. Around me stretched an endless expanse of fractured landscapes. Mountains that folded into themselves, rivers that ran upward into empty skies. Figures moved in the distance, their shapes indistinct, like shadows cast by invisible flames. The static figure stood before me, its form solidifying for just a moment. "This is the between," it said. "You will hold the cracks." "I don't understand," I said, my voice trembling. "You will," it replied, "or you will break." And then it was gone, leaving me alone in the shifting expanse. The cracks are everywhere here, glowing faintly in the ground, the air, even my own reflection in the glass-like surface. They pulse like veins, waiting for me to fix them, or to fall through them. I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't work the same way anymore. But I can feel the threads pulling tighter, the cracks widening. And I know the reflection is still watching, waiting for me to falter. It was the kind of bookstore you only find when you're not looking for it. Tucked into a narrow alley I'd never noticed before, its sign was barely legible, second-story books. The letters were faded and cracked, as though they hadn't been repainted in decades. The windows were streaked with grime, and the faint scent of old paper wafted out every time the door creaked open. I hadn't planned on going inside, but the rain had started, and I didn't have an umbrella. That's how it always starts, doesn't it? A simple decision, a step in an unexpected direction. Inside, the bookstore was dimly lit and cramped, shelves towering so high they nearly brushed the ceiling. The aisles were labyrinthine, twisting and branching at impossible angles. It felt bigger than it should have been, as though the store extended far beyond the dimensions of the building. An elderly man sat behind the counter, hunched over a massive ledger. He didn't look up when I walked in, just muttered a gravelly, "Welcome." I nodded politely and wandered deeper into the store, my footsteps muffled by the threadbare carpet. The books were a strange mix of old and new. Yellowed tomes with cracked spines sat next to glossy hardcovers with titles I didn't recognize. Every now and then, I'd pick one up, but the moment I opened it, the words on the pages seemed to blur and shift, as though they weren't meant for me. That's when I saw it. It wasn't on a shelf, but on a small pedestal tucked into a shadowy corner. The book was bound in dark leather, its surface engraved with symbols that looked faintly familiar, though I couldn't place them. There was no title, no author, just those strange markings and a faint shimmer that seemed to pulse when I looked at it too long. Against my better judgment, I reached for it. The leather was cold to the touch, and the book felt heavier than it should have. When I opened it, the pages were blank. I flipped through, expecting something, anything, but there was nothing, just an endless stretch of empty, yellowed paper. Don't! The voice startled me, and I nearly dropped the book. I turned to see the man from the counter standing behind me. His eyes, sharp and pale, locked onto mine. "That's not for you," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm sorry," I stammered, placing the book back on the pedestal. "I didn't mean to." "It's not about meaning to," he interrupted. "It's about what it takes." He gestured toward the book. "And you don't want to know the cost." Something about his tone sent a chill down my spine. I nodded quickly and backed away, mumbling an apology. But as I turned to leave, the strangest thing happened. The book was in my hand. I hadn't picked it up again. I was sure of it. Yet there it was, its weight familiar now, as though it belonged to me. The man's face darkened, and he took a step closer. "You need to put it back. Now." I don't know how it," my voice faltered as I tried to explain, but the words caught in my throat. The book felt like it was clinging to me, the leather warming beneath my touch. I tried to place it back on the pedestal, but my hand wouldn't let go. The man's eyes narrowed. "You opened it, didn't you?" Yes, but it was blank." His expression turned grim. They always are. At first, I didn't understand what he meant, but I didn't have time to ask. The lights in the store flickered, and a low hum filled the air, vibrating through the floor. The books on the shelves began to tremble, some toppling to the ground as the hum grew louder, almost deafening. "Go," the man said, his voice cutting through the noise. "Get out. Now." I didn't need to be told twice. I clutched the book to my chest and ran, weaving through the twisting aisles as the store seemed to shift around me. The walls narrowed, the shelves stretching upward, their shadows curling and twisting like grasping hands. When I finally burst through the front door, the rain had stopped. The alley was silent, the bookstore behind me dark. The sign was gone. In its place was a blank, weathered facade, the windows boarded up. I staggered back to my apartment, the book still clutched in my arms. I thought about throwing it away, about leaving it on the sidewalk or burning it, but every time I tried, something stopped me. It felt like a part of me now, an extension of my thoughts and fears. That night, I placed the book on my desk and stared at it. Slowly, the blank pages began to change. Words appeared, scrawled in sharp, angular handwriting. "We've been waiting for you." The next morning, I tried to return to the alley, but it wasn't there. The space where the bookstore had been was just a solid brick wall. The book hasn't left my side since. The pages aren't blank anymore. Every night, they fill with new words, detailing things I haven't done yet, choices I haven't made, places I haven't been. But they're never suggestions. They're instructions. Last night, it told me to leave my apartment at 3:17 a.m. and walk to the corner of 5th and Pine. There, I found a man waiting. He handed me a folded note, his face pale and familiar, like I'd seen him in a dream. The note read, "You're the next author." I don't know what it means, but the pages keep filling. And now, when I touch the book, it feels warm, alive, almost, as if it's feeding off me. I can't get rid of it. I can't stop it, and I can't help but wonder. If I keep writing its story, where will mine end? I'll never forget the night my brother came back. It was 2 months after the funeral. 2 months since we buried his ashes in a cemetery that felt too small for someone as full of life as Danny. He'd been my big brother, my protector, my partner in crime growing up. And then, just like that, he was gone. A drunk driver. A stupid accident. One moment, he was calling to tell me about his new job, and the next, I was identifying his body. Grief is a strange thing. Some days, you feel like you're suffocating under the weight of it, and others, you feel nothing at all. That night was one of the latter. I'd been sitting alone in the house we grew up in, the one Danny and I had inherited after our parents passed. The house was quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I just turned off the TV and was about to head to bed when I heard it. 3 loud knocks at the front door. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. No one ever knocked that late, especially not in our neighborhood. But then it came again. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks that echoed through the house. I froze. Something about the sound felt wrong. It wasn't just the timing. It was the rhythm, the force, like whoever was on the other side wasn't just knocking but demanding to be let in. I crept toward the door, my heart hammering in my chest. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. No answer. I glanced through the peephole, expecting to see an empty porch. Instead, I saw Danny. He was standing there, his face pale in the glow of the porch light. His hair was messy, just like it always was, and he was wearing the same hoodie he'd had on the last time I saw him alive. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, that grief had finally pushed me over the edge. But he was real, solid, standing right there. "Danny?" I whispered, my throat tight. He smiled, a small, sad smile. "Hey, little sis," he said. His voice was exactly the same, warm and familiar, and it broke something inside me. I opened the door without thinking. The cold night air rushed in, but Danny didn't move. He just stood there, his hands in his pockets, looking at me like he wasn't sure if he was welcome. "What? How?" I stammered, words failing me. This can't be real." "I know," he said softly. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to scare you." I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched his arm. It was solid, warm. He felt alive. But there was something off about him. His skin was too pale, his eyes too dark, like the life had been drained out of him. "Come inside," I said, stepping back. He hesitated, then crossed the threshold. The air seemed to grow colder as he entered, and the light in the hallway flickered. I noticed it, but I didn't care. I was too overwhelmed by the fact that my brother, my dead brother, was standing in front of me. We sat in the living room, just like we used to, and for a while, it almost felt normal. We talked about stupid things, his favorite movies, the time we got caught sneaking out as kids. But the longer we talked, the stranger it felt. He didn't laugh the way he used to, and his smiles never reached his eyes. There was an emptiness to him, like he was going through the motions. "Why are you here?" I finally asked, the question heavy on my tongue. His expression darkened. "I came back for you." The words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean?" "I couldn't leave you alone," he said, his voice low. "Not after everything. You've been so sad, so lost. I couldn't let go." Tears welled up in my eyes. "Danny, you're not supposed to be here. You're gone. This isn't right." His face twisted, a flicker of anger crossing it. "You think I don't know that? You think I wanted this? I didn't have a choice." His voice echoed unnaturally, filling the room in a way that didn't make sense. The lights flickered again, and the shadows in the room seemed to stretch, curling toward him like they were alive. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, and I realized for the first time that I was afraid. "Danny," I said, my voice trembling, "you need to leave." His eyes met mine, and for a moment, I saw something in them I didn't recognize. Something dark, something hungry. "I can't," he said. "You let me in. I can't leave now." My stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" "I'm not supposed to be here," he said, his voice cracking. "But neither are you." The room seemed to tilt, the shadows creeping closer. His face began to change, his features twisting into something almost unrecognizable. His skin turned ashen, his eyes black as coal, and his mouth stretched into a jagged, unnatural grin. "You should have left me alone," he said, his voice no longer his own. "Now we're both trapped." I bolted for the door, my heart pounding, but the room seemed to stretch infinitely, the walls warping and twisting. The shadows lunged toward me, cold and clawing, and I screamed. And then, nothing. I woke up in my bed, drenched in sweat, the morning sun streaming through the window. For a moment, I thought it had been a dream. But when I went to the living room, the door was open, swinging slightly in the breeze. I haven't been able to step back into that house since. I've told myself it wasn't real, that it was just my grief manifesting in a terrible way. But every night at 3:33 a.m., I hear it, 3 sharp knocks on whatever door is closest. I don't answer. I don't even look, because I know if I do, it won't just be Danny waiting for me. There's a stretch of road outside my town that nobody talks about. It's not on any maps, and there's no reason to take it unless you're lost, or stupidly curious, like I was. The road doesn't even have a name. People just call it the Gray Mile, which is fitting. Everything about it feels washed out. The trees lining the sides are bare, even in summer. The asphalt looks faded, almost white in some spots, and the air feels different there. Heavier, quieter. The stories about the Gray Mile have been around forever. Most of them are vague, half-told tales about people who drive down it and don't come back. A friend of mine once said he took the road on a dare and lost 3 hours of his life. He couldn't explain where the time had gone, only that it was dark when it shouldn't have been, and he had no memory of what happened. I should have left it alone. But last Friday, after a long week and too much whiskey, I decided to see it for myself. It was late, probably close to midnight, when I turned onto the Gray Mile. My headlights cut through the darkness, revealing the gnarled trees and cracked asphalt. The road was narrow, just wide enough for one car, and it seemed to stretch forever, disappearing into the black. For the first 10 minutes, nothing happened. It was just an eerie stretch of road, the kind that makes you grip the steering wheel a little tighter. I told myself it was just a story, a way for bored locals to scare each other. But then the headlights flickered. It was just a quick dimming, like the bulbs were straining. I tapped the dash, annoyed, and they came back on. The car kept rolling forward, and I tried to shake off the unease creeping up my spine. Then the radio turned on by itself. The static was loud, crackling through the speakers, even though I hadn't touched the dial. I reached over to turn it off, but the knob didn't work. The volume kept climbing, the static giving way to a faint voice, like someone whispering just beneath the noise. I slammed my hand against the dashboard, and the radio went silent. I thought about turning back, but something about the road wouldn't let me. The trees seemed closer now, their branches stretching toward the car like bony fingers. The air was colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes your teeth chatter. That's when I saw the figure. It was standing in the middle of the road, about 50 feet ahead. A tall, shadowy shape that didn't move. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a tree or some debris. But as I got closer, it became clear it was a person, or something pretending to be a person. Its proportions were off, too long and too thin, like it had been stretched. Its head tilted slightly to one side, and its arms hung limply at its sides. I hit the brakes, the car skidding slightly on the loose gravel. The figure didn't flinch. I don't know why I didn't just throw the car into reverse and floor it. Something about it held me there, rooted to the spot. I rolled the window down slightly, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hey," I called, my voice shaky. "Are you okay?" The figure twitched. Not a step forward, not a full motion. Just a small, unnatural jerk, like a marionette being tugged by invisible strings. And then it started walking toward me. Its movements were jerky, erratic, like it didn't quite know how to use its body. The closer it got, the more wrong it looked. Its skin wasn't right, too pale, almost gray, and its eyes weren't eyes at all, just empty pits. I threw the car into reverse and slammed on the gas, the tires screeching as I tried to get away. The headlights flickered again, and for a split second, the figure disappeared. Then it was in front of me. I screamed, jerking the wheel to the side. The car skidded off the road and slammed into a tree. The airbag deployed, the impact knocking the wind out of me. When I opened my eyes, everything was quiet. Too quiet. The figure was gone. I sat there for what felt like hours, my hands trembling, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The engine had died, and the world outside was pitch black. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal, no GPS, just a blank screen and the faint hum of static that seemed to fill the air. Then I heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the back of the car. Tap, tap, tap. I turned slowly, my heart in my throat, and saw the faint outline of something pressed against the rear window. A face, if you could call it that, staring at me with those empty pits where eyes should have been. Its mouth was moving, but no sound came out. I threw open the door and ran. I don't remember much after that. Just the sound of my own footsteps pounding against the road, the cold air burning my lungs, and the overwhelming sense that something was chasing me. Eventually, I stumbled onto a main road, where a passing truck driver found me. He called the police, but they didn't believe me. They said the Gray Mile was just an old road, nothing more. But I know what I saw. Sometimes, late at night, I hear that tapping sound again. It's faint, just outside my window, and it always comes in threes. Tap, tap, tap. I don't go driving at night anymore, and I sure as hell stay away from that road. But deep down, I know it's not over. The Gray Mile isn't just a road. It's a door, and something is waiting on the other side. I had always thought of my hometown as the kind of place where nothing happened. The most exciting thing in recent memory was when a black bear wandered onto Main Street, and even that ended peacefully with the bear sauntering back into the woods. But something happened to me one summer that changed how I saw my town forever. It was the summer I met the collector. I just graduated college and moved back home while job hunting. To pass the time and make some money, I started exploring old estates and antique shops for items I could resell online. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept me busy. One day, while browsing through a local estate sale, I overheard two men talking about the house on Red Fern Road. "Place is cursed," one said, shaking his head. "No one's lived there in years." "Not cursed, just a hoarder's nightmare," the other replied. "But there's stuff in there, I tell you. Stuff you wouldn't believe." That was all I needed to hear. Red Fern Road wasn't far from my parents' house, and I knew exactly which house they were talking about. It was one of those places kids dared each other to run up to and touch. A sprawling Victorian surrounded by an overgrown lawn and a rusted iron gate. I'd never seen anyone go in or out. The next day, armed with a flashlight and a backpack, I decided to check it out. The gate was unlocked, swinging open with a groan that echoed in the stillness. The yard was eerily quiet, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and lifeless, its paint peeling in long, ragged strips. When I stepped onto the porch, the wood creaked loudly beneath my feet, and for a moment, I thought about turning back. But curiosity pushed me forward. The front door was ajar, as if inviting me in. The inside was even worse than I expected. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of mildew and something metallic. Piles of objects were stacked haphazardly everywhere. Old books, broken furniture, rusted tools. The walls were lined with shelves crammed full of jars, each one containing something different. Faded photographs, yellowed bones, tufts of hair. I felt like I'd stepped into a mausoleum of forgotten things. As I made my way deeper into the house, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. The shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, and every creak of the floorboards sounded like footsteps. I told myself it was just my imagination, but it didn't help. Then I found the room. It was at the end of a narrow hallway, the door slightly ajar. The space inside was impossibly clean, a stark contrast to the rest of the house. A single wooden table sat in the center, and on it was a box. The box was small, made of dark wood with intricate carvings. It seemed out of place, like it didn't belong there. I hesitated, but eventually, I reached out and opened it. Inside was a collection of strange, delicate trinkets. A tiny porcelain doll's head, a silver locket, an old brass key, and, oddly, a black feather. But as I examined them, I noticed something chilling. They weren't just random objects. Each one was accompanied by a small, handwritten tag, and each tag had a name. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach when I saw the last tag. My name. I dropped the box, the the contents scattering across the floor. My flashlight flickered, plunging the room into near darkness. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled to pick up the items, my hands trembling. Then I heard it, a low, wet-breathing sound, coming from behind me. I turned slowly, the flashlight shaking in my grip. Standing in the doorway was a figure, tall, thin, and shrouded in shadows. Its head tilted unnaturally to one side, and its eyes gleamed like dull coins in the dim light. "You shouldn't be here," it said, its voice a rasp that scraped against my ears. I froze, my mind racing. I didn't mean to," I stammered, but it cut me off. "These things," it said, gesturing toward the box, "are mine." "I'm sorry," I whispered, backing toward the door. The figure didn't move. "Go," it said, "but remember, I always collect what's owed." I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted, leaving the box and everything else behind. The house seemed to close in around me as I ran, the shadows growing thicker and the air colder. By the time I burst out the front door, I was gasping for breath, my heart pounding so loudly I thought it might burst. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. As I fumbled with the keys, I glanced back at the house. The figure was standing in the window, watching me. I never went back to Red Fern Road. I quit scavenging for antiques altogether and eventually moved to another state. But the memory of that house haunts me. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I can hear faint, raspy breathing just outside my door. And every so often, I receive a package in the mail. Inside, there's always a single item, a feather, a key, a locket, and a tag with my name. I've never been superstitious. Ghosts, bad omens, curses, it's all nonsense to me. Or it was, until the night I found the journal. It happened during a job I took out of desperation. I'd been hired to clean out an old mansion that was set to be demolished. The pay was decent, and the job seemed easy enough. Clear out whatever the last owner left behind and make sure the place was empty before the demolition crew arrived. The mansion was a monster of a house, all cracked stone and sagging balconies, with ivy creeping up its sides like veins. Inside, it was a wreck, broken furniture, faded wallpaper peeling in long strips, and dust so thick it felt like I was inhaling history with every breath. The place gave me the creeps, but I chalked it up to the usual abandoned house vibes and got to work. I found the journal in a small, locked chest in what must have once been a study. The chest was buried under a mountain of papers and books, its lock rusted shut. When I finally pried it open, there it was, an unassuming leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age. Curiosity got the better of me. I opened it. The first page had a name scrawled in elegant handwriting, Victor Hargrave. The second page was a single sentence. "If you are reading this, you have already made a terrible mistake." A shiver ran down my spine, but I kept reading. The entries started innocuously enough, accounts of Victor's daily life, his fascination with the occult, and his frustrations with the closed-minded fools in his social circle. But as I flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The writing grew erratic, the sentences jagged and frenzied. Victor wrote about something he had summoned, something he called the passenger. He didn't describe it directly, but he hinted at its form. A shadow that moved without light, a whisper that spoke without sound. He wrote about its promises of power, its whispers that filled his dreams. And then he wrote about the price. I don't know how long I sat there reading, but by the time I reached the last entry, my hands were trembling. The passenger is not bound to me. It is bound to the book, to anyone who reads its words, to anyone who opens the door. If you have come this far, it is already watching. It will not stop. I slammed the journal shut, my heart racing. It was ridiculous, just the ramblings of a madman. But the room felt colder now, the shadows deeper. I told myself I'd throw the journal away, bury it with the rest of the junk, and forget about it. But as I stuffed it into a box, I thought I heard something, a faint, low hum, like the resonance of a distant voice. The rational part of me dismissed it as the wind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I dreamt of a figure standing at the foot of my bed. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, its face hidden in shadow. When I woke up, drenched in sweat, I half expected to see it still there. The next day, I went back to the mansion, determined to finish the job and leave that journal far behind. But as I walked through the empty halls, I felt watched. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the old house, set my nerves on edge. By the time I got to the study, the journal was sitting on the desk. I froze. I hadn't left it there. It wasn't just that it had moved. It was open. The pages fluttered slightly, as if caught in a breeze. But the air was still. I should have left right then and there. I should have run. But something drew me closer, an inexplicable pull I couldn't resist. The writing on the open page was different now. Not Victor's neat cursive, but something jagged, chaotic, almost burned into the paper. "You can't ignore me." I backed away, my breath coming in shallow gasps. That's when I heard it. A whisper, soft but insistent, coming from the shadows in the corner of the room. I couldn't make out the words, but they weren't meant for my ears. They were meant for my mind. They slithered into my thoughts, twisting and turning, making it impossible to focus. I don't remember how I got out of the house. One moment I was in that room, and the next I was in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. I drove home, locked every door, every window, and sat in the middle of my living room, waiting for the feeling to pass. But it didn't. The shadows in my apartment seemed wrong. They moved when they shouldn't have, stretched in ways that defied logic. And the whispers, they followed me, growing louder when the lights went out, softer when I turned them back on. The worst part was the journal. I left it at the mansion. I'm sure of it. But 2 nights later, it was on my kitchen table, open to a blank page. A blank page that filled itself with words as I stared, frozen in terror. "You let me in." I haven't slept since. The whispers are always there, waiting. The shadows never stay still. And every time I try to get rid of the journal, it finds its way back. I don't know what Victor summoned, what he bound to those pages. But I know this, it doesn't want to leave. And neither will I. A soft, rhythmic clicking, just outside my bedroom window. I heard it for the first time on a night when the wind was still and the world was quiet. It was faint enough that I almost ignored it, brushing it off as a branch tapping against the glass. Except there were no trees near my window. I sat up, straining to hear. The clicking paused for a moment, then started again, slightly faster this time. I told myself it was probably nothing, but my body refused to relax. There was something too deliberate about it, too intentional. "Just look," I muttered to myself, swinging my legs over the edge of the bed. The floor felt unnaturally cold against my bare feet as I crept to the window. My heart was pounding by the time I reached for the curtain. Slowly, cautiously, I pulled it aside. Nothing. The street below was empty, the lamppost casting a weak yellow glow over the sidewalk. I exhaled, laughing at my paranoia, and climbed back into bed. But the sound came back the next night, and the night after that. It wasn't just clicking anymore. There was a faint scratching now, like fingernails dragging across the glass. Sometimes it would stop abruptly, only to start again a moment later, as if it was waiting for me to react. One night, I worked up the courage to open the window. I leaned out into the cold night air, scanning the empty street below, but there was nothing there. No branches, no wires, no signs of anything that could be causing the sound. That's when I saw the first mark, a thin, jagged scratch on the glass, right at eye level. It hadn't been there before. I ran my finger over it, feeling the rough edge, and my stomach churned. The next morning, I called a glazier to inspect the window. He showed up, a cheerful guy with a thick New Jersey accent, and ran his hands over the glass. "This is weird," he muttered. "What's weird?" He tilted his head, narrowing his eyes at the scratch. "Looks like it came from the outside, but there's no debris, no rocks, nothing that would do this. Just weird, is all." "Could it be an animal?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not unless you've got a raccoon with a diamond cutter out there." I tried to laugh, but it sounded hollow. The noises stopped for a while after that. I thought maybe it had been some fluke, a trick of my imagination, or something so mundane it didn't bear thinking about. I let myself believe that, even as unease lingered in the back of my mind. Then the dreams started. In the first one, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. I couldn't move. My limbs felt heavy, my chest tight. The room was dark except for the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the window. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved across the ceiling, slow and deliberate, its edges too sharp to be human. It didn't have a shape I could describe, but it felt wrong, like it didn't belong here, in this world. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. When I woke up, my throat was sore, and there was another scratch on the window. The dreams became more vivid after that. In one, I was standing in the middle of my room, staring at the window. The glass was gone, replaced by a yawning black void that seemed to hum with energy. Something was on the other side, its silhouette flickering like static on an old TV. It reached for me. I don't remember what happened next, but I woke up gasping, my heart racing. There was a new scratch on the window. This one wasn't jagged like the others. It was smooth, deliberate, forming a crude spiral. I tried covering the window with a blanket, but it didn't help. The noises continued, growing louder and more insistent. One night, I woke up to find the blanket torn down, the spiral glowing faintly in the darkness. I stopped sleeping. I stayed up for days, drinking coffee until my hands shook, forcing myself to stay awake. The scratches on the window multiplied, spreading outward like cracks in a spider web. One night, I heard a new sound. It wasn't clicking or scratching this time. It was a voice. Soft, low, almost a whisper. "Let me in." I froze, my blood turning to ice. The voice was calm, almost soothing, but there was an edge to it, something that made my skin crawl. "Let me in," it said again, more insistent this time. I backed away from the window, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The voice grew louder. "Let me in. You've already opened the door." My back hit the wall, and I sank to the floor, covering my ears. But the voice didn't stop. It echoed in my head, louder and louder, until it felt like my skull was about to split open. And then it stopped. The silence was worse. When I finally looked up, the window was gone. Not broken, not shattered, just gone. In its place was the same black void from my dream, humming faintly with energy. I don't know how long I sat there, staring into the void. Hours, maybe, days. Eventually, I got up and walked toward it. And now I'm here, wherever here is. The void is everywhere, stretching endlessly in all directions. There's no sound, no light, just the faint hum that never stops. And sometimes, in the distance, I hear it. The clicking. 3 sharp raps on my apartment door at 3:12 a.m. I was jarred awake, disoriented and still half dreaming. My first thought was that it had to be my neighbor, Mrs. Bennett. She was sweet but forgetful, often locking herself out late at night. I swung my legs over the side of the bed, rubbing the sleep from my eyes as I shuffled to the door. "Mrs. Bennett?" I called softly, peering through the peephole. The hallway was empty. I stood there for a moment, my forehead pressed against the cool wood, trying to convince myself I'd imagined it. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it wasn't from the door. It was coming from inside my apartment. The sound echoed through the darkness, sharp and deliberate, like someone tapping on a window pane. My chest tightened, and I turned slowly, scanning the dim shapes of my furniture. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice cracking. No response. The tapping came again, louder this time. It was definitely coming from the living room window. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy book from the coffee table, and crept toward the window, my heart hammering in my chest. The blinds were drawn, but I could see a faint silhouette through the slats, backlit by the streetlight outside. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. The silhouette didn't move. With shaking hands, I reached for the blinds and yanked them open. Nothing. The street below was empty, the sidewalk gleaming wet from a light drizzle. The tapping had stopped. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my breath fogging up the glass. When nothing happened, I lowered the book and let out a shaky laugh. It was probably a tree branch or some loose siding flapping in the wind. I was just being paranoid. But as I turned to go back to bed, I froze. There, written on the glass in faint, foggy letters, were 3 words. "Are you awake?" I stumbled back, my legs threatening to give out. The letters faded quickly, the fog on the window dissipating as if it had never been there. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a prank, or I'd been half asleep and imagined the whole thing. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That evening, as I sat on the couch trying to distract myself with a mindless TV show, my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "Did you see me?" My hands went cold. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. Then another text came through. "I saw you." I blocked the number and turned off my phone. For the next few days, I kept my curtains drawn and avoided going out after dark. Nothing happened. No knocks, no messages, no strange noises. I started to feel foolish, like I'd overreacted to a random prank. Then, on Friday night, I found the photo. It was lying on the floor just inside my front door, as if someone had slipped it under while I wasn't looking. The image was grainy, printed on cheap, glossy paper. It was a picture of me. I was standing at the living room window, staring out into the night. My face was pale, my eyes wide with fear. The photo wasn't taken from the street. It was taken from inside my apartment. I dropped it and backed away, my chest tightening as panic set in. My first instinct was to call the police, but what could I tell them? That someone had taken a creepy picture of me? They'd probably think I was crazy. Instead, I grabbed a hammer from the kitchen drawer and searched every inch of my apartment. The closets, the bathroom, under the bed. Every corner, every shadow. Nothing. But the feeling didn't go away, that heavy, suffocating sensation that I was being watched. That night, I didn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time, it was coming from the closet. I gripped the hammer tighter, my palms slick with sweat, and inched toward the sound. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The knocking stopped. I stood frozen, my hand on the closet door handle, debating whether to open it. Then, from inside, a voice whispered, "I've been waiting for you." I screamed and yanked the door open, swinging the hammer wildly, but the closet was empty. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not even my family. I moved to a new city, changed my number, deleted all my social media. For a while, it worked. Then, last night, I came home to find a package waiting for me. Inside was a single Polaroid. It was a picture of my new apartment, taken from the inside. It began on the subway. Late one evening, after a long day at work, I boarded the last train heading toward my neighborhood. The car was nearly empty except for a few scattered passengers. A man in a suit scrolling through his phone, a woman dozing with her headphones in, and a figure seated in the farthest corner. At first, I didn't notice the figure. They were hunched over, cloaked in a heavy coat despite the warm weather, their face obscured by shadows. I took a seat a few rows away, too tired to care about anything except getting home. The hum of the train and the rhythmic clatter of the tracks lulled me into a half-asleep haze. And then, I felt it, eyes on me. I glanced up instinctively, my gaze drawn to the far corner. The figure hadn't moved, but I was sure they were watching me. I couldn't see their face, just the vague outline of their body, a faint glimmer where their eyes might be. I quickly looked away, telling myself I was imagining it. People stare sometimes, especially on the subway. It didn't mean anything, but the feeling didn't go away. When the train pulled into the next station, the man in the suit got off. The car doors hissed shut, and the train lurched forward again, leaving just me, the dozing woman, and the figure in the corner. The air felt heavier, the fluorescent lights buzzing louder than usual. I glanced toward the figure again, unable to help myself, and froze. They were standing now, gripping one of the poles. Their posture was rigid, their head tilted slightly, as if studying me. I couldn't make out their features beneath the hood of their coat, but there was something unnatural about the way they stood, too still, too deliberate. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to look away. "It's fine," I thought. "People are weird. Just stay calm." The train screeched into another station, and the woman with the headphones got off, leaving me alone with the figure. When the train started moving again, they took a step toward me. I gripped the edge of my seat, my breath shallow. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice more shaky than I intended. They didn't respond. Instead, they took another step, and then another, the sound of their boots against the floor unnervingly loud in the empty car. I stood up, adrenaline surging. "Hey, back off," I snapped, trying to sound braver than I felt. That's when they stopped, tilting their head the other way, as if puzzled. For a moment, we just stared at each other. And then, without warning, the lights in the car flickered and went out. The train plunged into darkness, and I froze, every muscle in my body locking up. The only sounds were the clatter of the train on the tracks and my own ragged breathing. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The lights flickered back on, and the car was empty. The figure was gone. My heart raced as I spun around, searching the car. There was no sign of them. No coat, no boots, no shadowy outline. It was as if they'd vanished into thin air. The train pulled into my station moments later, and I practically sprinted off, my chest tight with panic. I didn't look back until I reached the street, and when I finally did, the platform was empty. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe they'd gotten off at the station before the lights came back on. Maybe I'd just been too jumpy, too tired to think straight. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At 3:12 a.m., I woke to the sound of footsteps outside my apartment door. They were slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth, the sound muffled but unmistakable. I held my breath, straining to listen, my heart pounding in my ears. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, the footsteps stopped. I waited for what felt like hours, clutching the blankets like a shield, but the silence stretched on. When I finally worked up the courage to check the peephole, the hallway was empty. The next day, I noticed something strange. On my way to work, as I passed by my reflection in a shop window, I thought I saw someone standing behind me, a figure in a heavy coat, their face obscured by a hood. But when I turned around, there was no one there. It happened again later that evening, this time in the mirrored walls of the subway station. The reflection was clearer this time, standing several feet behind me, their head tilted in that same unsettling way. I spun around, panic flaring, but the platform was empty. By the third day, I stopped looking at my reflection altogether, but that didn't stop them. That night, as I sat in my living room, trying to distract myself with TV, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they weren't in the hallway. They were inside. I turned slowly, every nerve in my body screaming to run, but I couldn't move. The figure was standing in the corner of the room, their hood pulled low over their face. "What do you want?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. They didn't respond. Instead, they reached up and slowly pulled back the hood. What I saw wasn't a face. It was a reflection of my own. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because my neighbors called the police. By the time they arrived, the figure was gone, and I was left stammering, unable to explain what had happened. They found no sign of forced entry, no footprints, nothing. That was weeks ago. I moved out of the apartment the next day, but no matter where I go, I see them. In reflections, in shadows, in the edges of my vision. They're always there. And sometimes, late at night, I hear the footsteps again. "Hi, it's me. Call me back when you can." The thing is, the voice was mine. At first, I thought it was some kind of prank, a convincing AI clone or something. But when I checked the number, it was my own. My phone had somehow called itself while I was sleeping. I played it again, trying to pick apart the tone, the cadence. It was identical to my voice, but something about it was off. There was a slight tremor, a hesitation between the words, like whoever, or whatever, had left the message wasn't entirely sure they were saying the right thing. I deleted the voicemail and tried to forget about it. The next day, it happened again. "Hi, it's me. We need to talk." Same voice, same number, same creeping unease in my chest. I tried calling my number to see if I could force the anomaly to stop, but all I got was a busy signal. My phone's call log didn't show the outgoing calls, and there was no record of me ever leaving the messages. That night, I heard a knock at my apartment door. It was soft, almost polite. 3 short taps. I opened the door, expecting a delivery or a neighbor needing something, but there was no one there. Just an empty hallway. On the floor, right outside the door, was a single sheet of paper folded in half. Inside was a handwritten message, "Pick up next time." I checked the peephole before closing the door and locking it twice. The next voicemail came at 3:17 a.m. This time, the voice was different. Still mine, but weaker, like I was speaking from underwater. "I think I'm stuck," it said, trembling. "Please, you have to listen." I sat in bed, staring at my phone, heart racing. What did that even mean? Stuck where? I didn't sleep that night. The following day, I found another note on my kitchen counter. "You're not alone." My apartment was locked when I left and locked when I returned. There were no signs of forced entry, no windows open, no disturbed furniture. But the note was there, written in the same shaky handwriting as the first. The voicemail that night was worse. "Why aren't you helping me?" it pleaded. "It's getting closer. Please, you don't have much time." I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up with my phone in my hand, the voicemail still playing on repeat. The next time it called, I picked up. "Hello?" My voice cracked, my throat dry. There was no response, just breathing, slow, shallow, and unmistakably mine. Then, quietly, it whispered, "Look out the window." Every instinct told me not to, but I couldn't stop myself. I walked to the window, pulling back the curtain with trembling fingers. At first, there was nothing, just the empty street below, illuminated by flickering streetlights. But then I saw it. A figure stood on the sidewalk, staring up at my window. It was me. Same face, same clothes, same wide, terrified eyes. I stumbled back, dropping the curtain. My phone buzzed in my hand, another voicemail notification popping up. I didn't listen to it. I couldn't. The figure stayed outside for hours, unmoving, until the first light of dawn crept over the horizon. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, it was gone. But the notes kept coming. One on my bathroom mirror, "You can't hide forever." One on my pillow, "It knows where you are." One scrawled across the fridge in what looked like ash, "Let me in." The voicemails changed too. My voice grew fainter, more frantic. The most recent one was barely audible, but I could make out 2 words, repeated over and over. "Help me, help me, help me." I tried smashing my phone, thinking that might stop it, but the messages didn't come from the phone anymore. They came from the walls. Soft, muffled whispers echoed through the apartment, seeping out from the plaster like water through cracks. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but the words grew clearer, louder, until they were unmistakable. "Let me in." Last night, I barricaded the door with furniture. It didn't matter. At 2:15 a.m., I woke up to find the figure standing in my bedroom. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, its face blank and unreadable. It wasn't until it tilted its head that I realized it wasn't copying me anymore. I don't know what it wants, but the last voicemail I got before my phone died had one final message. "It's your turn now. The figure is closer tonight, and I think it's smiling." I was brushing my teeth before bed, the fluorescent light in the bathroom buzzing faintly above me. Everything was normal, routine. I rinsed my mouth, wiped my face, and reached for the light switch to turn it off. That's when I saw it. In the mirror, I was still brushing my teeth. At first, I froze, thinking I must have been seeing things. The motion was subtle, just the up and down rhythm of my hand, the brush scraping against my teeth. My mind raced to catch up. I wasn't holding the toothbrush anymore. It was on the sink, next to the faucet, right where I'd left it. But in the mirror, I was still brushing. I stood there, watching in stunned silence as the reflection carried on with the same mechanical motion, oblivious to me. Then, slowly, it stopped. The reflection lowered the toothbrush, spat into the sink, and looked up, right at me, and it smiled. I stumbled out of the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. For a moment, I stood there, my back pressed against the door, trying to convince myself that it hadn't happened. I was just tired, stressed, imagining things. I took a deep breath and opened the door again. The mirror was empty. Not broken or shattered, just empty. The toothbrush was still on the sink. The lights were still buzzing. But my reflection was gone. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, everything seemed normal. My reflection was back in the mirror, perfectly in sync with me. I laughed it off, feeling ridiculous for how scared I'd been. But as the day went on, the unease lingered. Every reflective surface I passed, windows, puddles, even the glossy screen of my phone, I found myself checking, just to be sure. That night, it happened again. I was sitting on the couch, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when I noticed the dark TV screen across the room. It was off, but it was reflective enough to show the faint outline of my body. At least, it should have been. Instead, the image in the screen showed me standing up, staring straight ahead. I blinked, my stomach dropping. Slowly, I turned to look at the TV. My reflection didn't move. It stayed frozen in that same eerie position, its head slightly tilted, its eyes locked on me. Then it raised a hand and waved. I scrambled to my feet, knocking over the coffee table in my panic. The TV screen flickered for a moment, and when I looked back, the reflection was gone. But I could feel it. That hollow, sinking feeling of being watched. I spun around, my eyes darting to every shadow in the room, but nothing was there. Nothing except the mirrors. Over the next few days, I avoided reflective surfaces as much as possible. I covered the mirrors in my apartment with towels, stopped looking at windows, even ditched my phone screen for an old flip phone. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that my reflection was still there, just out of sight, waiting. It got worse when they started moving without me. I'd glance at a window and catch a flicker of motion, something that looked like me, stepping out of frame before I could focus on it. At work, the chrome of the elevator doors showed a shadowed figure standing behind me, but when I turned around, I was alone. My coworkers noticed the bags under my eyes, the jumpiness in my movements, but I couldn't tell them what was wrong. How do you explain something like this without sounding insane? The final straw came one night when I was lying in bed, the room dark and silent. I hadn't turned on the bathroom light, hadn't uncovered the mirrors, hadn't done anything to tempt whatever was happening. But when I opened my eyes, I saw it. A face. It was hovering just above me, so close I could feel its presence more than see it. It wasn't exactly my face, but it was close enough to send a jolt of terror through my body. The features were off, too sharp, too angular, the eyes too wide and dark. Its lips curled into that same too big smile, and it whispered one word. Soon. When I blinked, it was gone. I left my apartment the next morning, checking into a cheap motel on the edge of town. The mirrors there were small and easy to cover, and I told myself it would be enough. But as I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank TV screen, I realized something chilling. I didn't remember leaving the apartment. I didn't remember packing my bags, locking the door, or driving here. It was like I'd been watching someone else's life from behind a pane of glass, and now I was trapped on the wrong side. The TV flickered to life, even though I hadn't touched the remote. Static filled the screen, rippling and distorting until an image appeared. It was me, or at least, it looked like me. The figure on the screen was sitting in my apartment, smiling that too big smile, the corners of its mouth stretching unnaturally wide. It leaned closer, filling the screen, and tilted its head. "I'm almost ready," it said, its voice crackling through the static. "Are you?" The TV went dark, and in the blank, reflective screen, I saw my reflection for the last time. It wasn't moving. It was just watching. The night the stars fell, the world didn't end. It paused. I was sitting on my apartment balcony, nursing the last of a cheap beer and trying not to think too hard about the pile of unpaid bills on my kitchen counter. The city stretched below me, a sprawling maze of lights and noise that never really slept. But tonight, the air felt different, thicker, like the universe was holding its breath. At first, I thought it was fireworks. A streak of silver shot across the sky, followed by another, and then another, until the heavens were alive with light. But there were no booms, no cheers from the street below. Just silence, punctuated by the faint hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I leaned over the railing, craning my neck to get a better look, and that's when I saw it. A single star, larger than the rest, brighter, falling slower. It wasn't white or silver, but a deep, pulsing blue, like a heartbeat in the night. It was heading straight for the park. Before I realized what I was doing, I was on my feet, grabbing my jacket and racing down the stairs. The streets were eerily empty, the usual din of the city muted as though it, too, was waiting. When I reached the park, the air was electric, charged with a static that made the hairs on my arms stand up. The blue star had landed, or rather, it hovered a few feet above the ground in the middle of the field, pulsing softly. It was smaller than I'd imagined, no bigger than a basketball, its surface smooth and glassy, but it gave off a light that seemed to seep into my skin, warming me from the inside out. I wasn't alone. A woman stood on the opposite side of the field, her silhouette stark against the glowing orb. She was tall, her hair a cascade of dark curls, and she held herself with a stillness that felt unnatural, like she was part of the scene rather than a person moving through it. "You're the first to arrive," she said, her voice carrying effortlessly across the space between us. I hesitated, unsure whether to move closer or stay where I was. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She tilted her head, her eyes catching the light in a way that made them look almost silver. "That depends. What do you see?" I frowned, turning back to the orb. "A star? I don't know. A light?" She smiled faintly, as though amused. "Not quite. It's a door." "A door to what?" "To whatever you need it to be." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, I thought she was joking. But the orb pulsed again, and something inside me shifted, like a string being plucked deep in my chest. Images flashed in my mind. Memories, dreams, moments I'd long buried. My mother's laugh as she spun me around in the kitchen when I was 6. The quiet ache of watching my college friends move on while I stayed behind. The empty space beside me on too many nights, a reminder of the love I'd never quite found. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling at my sides. "What do you mean? Whatever I need it to be." The woman stepped closer, her movements fluid, almost otherworldly. "This isn't the only door, you know. They fall when the universe deems it necessary, when the weight of too many unmade choices tilts the balance." "That doesn't make any sense," I said, though a part of me felt the truth in her words. "It rarely does." She gestured to the orb. "But you don't have to understand it to step through." I took a shaky step forward, the orb's light intensifying as I approached. The warmth it emitted wasn't just physical. It seeped into my thoughts, quieting the doubts and fears that usually roared like static. "What happens if I go through?" I asked. Her smile faded, replaced by something gentler, almost sad. "You find what you're looking for. Or maybe you find what's been looking for you. But the cost..." She stopped, as if reconsidering her words. "The cost is your choice to stay." I turned to her, my chest tightening. "Stay where?" "Here," she said simply. "In the life you've known." The weight of her words pressed down on me. I looked back at the orb, its pulsing light steady and inviting. I thought about my apartment, the job I hated, the empty spaces in my life that no amount of noise or distraction could fill. But I also thought about the small things. The barista who knew my order by heart, the stray cat that sometimes curled up on my balcony, the way the city hummed like a living thing on a summer night. "What if I don't go?" I asked. The woman's expression softened. "Then you carry on. The world keeps spinning, the stars keep falling, and maybe, one day, another door will find you. Or maybe it won't." I took a deep breath, my fingers curling into fists at my sides. The orb pulsed again, brighter this time, and I could feel its pull like a tide drawing me in. "I don't know if I'm ready," I admitted. "No one ever is," she said. "That's the point." For a moment, the world seemed to pause again, the only sound the soft hum of the orb. And then, without fully understanding why, I reached out, my hand hovering over its surface. The instant my fingers brushed the light, the world dissolved around me. I wasn't in the park anymore. I wasn't anywhere. The space around me was infinite and unknowable, filled with a warmth that felt like every kind word I'd ever heard, every embrace I'd ever needed. And within that space, I saw paths, thousands of them, each branching off into different possibilities. In one, I moved to a new city and started over, building a life I never thought I could. In another, I stayed and found joy in the smallest, most unexpected places. In others, the paths twisted into shapes I couldn't comprehend, filled with faces I didn't recognize but felt I'd always known. The choice wasn't made for me. It wasn't even clear what I was choosing. But when I opened my eyes, I was somewhere new. The stars were still falling, and the air was still thick with possibility. But this time, I wasn't running. I was ready to begin. The box was already on my doorstep when I got home. It was plain and unmarked, a cube of smooth, matte black about the size of a microwave. There was no label, no tape sealing it shut, just the box sitting there like it had always been part of my front porch. I didn't order anything. I nudged it with my foot. It didn't rattle or move. It was heavier than I expected, not something a prankster could just drop off and run. Glancing around, I saw no delivery truck, no neighbor loitering with an explanation, just the box and an unsettling silence in the air, like the world was holding its breath. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. The box was cool to the touch, heavier than it looked, but manageable. I brought it inside, placing it on my kitchen table. For a long moment, I just stared at it, half expecting it to do something. It didn't. Eventually, curiosity won. I searched for any seam or latch to open it, but the surface was seamless, almost unnervingly smooth. That's when I noticed it, a faint indent on the side, shaped like a handprint. My handprint, the exact size and shape of my own hand. I hesitated. Every instinct screamed at me to leave it alone, to get rid of it, but something deeper, something I couldn't explain, pulled me in. Slowly, I pressed my hand against the mark. The box clicked. The top split open with a hiss, releasing a puff of cool air that smelled faintly of metal. Inside was nothing, just darkness. Not an empty space, but a void so black it felt like it was absorbing the light around it. And then, something moved. It was subtle, a ripple in the darkness, like the surface of a still pond disturbed by a single drop. My breath caught as I leaned closer, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when the voice came. Do you remember? It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense. It was inside my head, smooth and calm, but with a weight that made my teeth ache. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but the voice continued. You called for me. No, I whispered, shaking my head. I didn't call for anything. You did. The voice was patient, almost amused. You just don't remember yet. The darkness in the box shifted again, and this time, something emerged. A shape, long and slender, rising out of the void like a hand reaching through water. It wasn't a hand, though. It was wrong. Too many joints, the angles too sharp. The thing held itself perfectly still, as if waiting for something. I stumbled back further, my chair scraping loudly against the tile. What are you? The voice answered, calm and steady. You invited me in. My mind raced. I tried to think back. Had I done anything recently, said anything that could have led to this? Nothing came to mind. I hadn't performed a seance, played with a Ouija board, or whispered into the dark hoping something would whisper back. I was just ordinary. Take it back, I said, my voice trembling. Whatever this is, take it back. The darkness pulsed. The shape in the void tilted slightly, as if considering my words. It doesn't work like that. What do you mean? I didn't ask for this. The voice grew softer, almost pitying. Your memory is incomplete. Let me show you. Before I could protest, the darkness surged outward. It didn't spill from the box. It reached, stretching toward me like liquid shadow. It moved faster than I could react, enveloping me in a wave of cold. The world around me vanished, replaced by an infinite expanse of black. And then, the memories began. I was standing in a room I didn't recognize, lit only by a flickering, dim light overhead. My hands were shaking, clutching something. A piece of paper. The words on it were smeared, the ink running like it had been soaked in water, but I could make out one phrase, "Sign here to forget." I looked up. Across from me was the same box, its surface unblemished, waiting. "You don't have to do this," a voice said, my voice. But it was too late. I was already pressing the pen to the paper, scrawling my name in shaky letters. As soon as I finished, the box clicked open, and the darkness swallowed me whole. The memory ended as abruptly as it began, and I was back in my kitchen, gasping for air. My hands trembled as I gripped the edge of the table, staring at the box. The voice was still there, calm and steady. "Now do you remember?" I did. I didn't want to, but I did. I had asked for this. I had invited it in, and I had erased the memory of doing so. "What do you want from me?" I whispered. "What you promised." The air in the room grew colder, heavy with a pressure that made my ears pop. The shape in the box emerged further, twisting and expanding. It wasn't just a hand. It wasn't just one thing. It was many things, shifting and folding into itself in ways that defied logic. "I don't have anything to give," I shouted, backing away. "I don't even know what you're talking about." The voice was almost gentle now. "You already gave it. You simply don't understand the cost yet." The darkness withdrew, collapsing back into the box. The lid closed with a final click, leaving the room eerily silent. I stared at the box, my chest heaving, waiting for something, anything, to happen, but nothing did. I wanted to throw it away, burn it, bury it, but I couldn't. I knew, deep down, that it wouldn't matter. The box was mine now, and it wasn't going anywhere. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the living room, staring at the box, waiting, and as the hours passed, I started to remember more. Pieces of the deal I'd made, fragments of what I'd traded away. Now, every time I close my eyes, I see it waiting in the void. And every time, the voice whispers the same words. "You called for me, and I am always listening." The stars were still falling, and the air was still thick with possibility. But this time, I wasn't running. I was ready to begin. It started as a favor. My friend Rachel needed someone to house sit for a weekend while she went to visit her parents. She and her husband had just bought an old farmhouse out in the middle of nowhere, and they hadn't gotten around to installing security cameras yet. She promised it would be easy. Just water the plants, feed the cat, and keep an eye on the place. I said yes because Rachel was the kind of friend who'd always been there for me. And besides, I thought it might be nice to spend a quiet weekend away from the noise of the city. I pictured myself curled up in her sunlit living room with a book and a cup of tea, surrounded by the idyllic charm of the countryside. That's not what happened. When I pulled up to the house on Friday evening, the sun was already setting. The farmhouse was beautiful in a storybook kind of way, 2 stories with white clapboard siding, a wraparound porch, and a bright red front door. But as I stepped out of my car, a sense of unease settled over me. The property was too quiet. Not peaceful, silent. No chirping crickets, no rustling leaves. Just an oppressive stillness that seemed to press in from all sides. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, grabbing my bag and heading inside. The interior of the house was cozy, just as Rachel had described. Hardwood floors, mismatched furniture, and shelves lined with books and knickknacks. The cat, a sleek black creature named Salem, was waiting for me in the kitchen, meowing for his dinner. I fed him, double-checked the instructions Rachel had left, and settled into the guest room for the night. I just started to doze off when I heard it, a soft knock. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again. 3 gentle taps, barely audible but unmistakable. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. The sound seemed to be coming from downstairs, near the front door. Probably just the wind, I told myself, even though there wasn't a breeze when I arrived. I crept down the stairs, my phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness. The front door was closed, locked just as I'd left it. I checked the windows, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the unease lingered, crawling up my spine like cold fingers. I went back to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard faint whispers, just on the edge of perception, too soft to make out but impossible to ignore. The next morning, I told myself I was overreacting. The house was old, and old houses made noises. I spent the day exploring the property, trying to shake off the weirdness of the night before. By the time the sun began to set, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it all. Almost. That night, the knocking came again, louder this time. 3 sharp, deliberate knocks that echoed through the house. I bolted upright, my heart hammering. Salem, who'd been curled up at the foot of the bed, hissed and darted under the dresser. I grabbed the nearest thing I could use as a weapon, a heavy flashlight, and crept downstairs. The front door was still locked, but the knocking didn't stop. It was coming from the back of the house now, at the door leading to the porch. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The knocking stopped. For a moment, there was silence. Then I heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving around the side of the house. I dialed Rachel's number, but it went straight to voicemail. My fingers hovered over 911, but something stopped me. Whoever, or whatever, was out there hadn't tried to get in. Yet, I spent the rest of the night sitting in the living room with every light on, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The footsteps circled the house a few more times before finally fading into the night. By the time the sun rose, I was exhausted but determined not to spend another night in that house. I called Rachel and told her something was wrong, that I thought someone was watching the house. She sounded concerned but insisted it was just a fluke. "It's a quiet area," she said. "Maybe it was a stray dog or a raccoon." I didn't believe her, but I agreed to stay one more night. I figured I could sleep during the day and keep watch after dark. That night, it wasn't just knocking. I was lying on the couch in the living room, every light blazing, when I heard the first creak. It sounded like footsteps inside the house. My blood turned to ice. I sat up, scanning the room, but nothing was out of place. The footsteps came again, louder this time, moving across the floor above me. The guest room. I grabbed the flashlight and a kitchen knife, my hands shaking as I climbed the stairs. The hallway was dark, the air cold and heavy. The door to the guest room was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I noticed something strange, the smell. A metallic, coppery scent that made my stomach turn. I pushed the door open and froze. The bed was unmade, the covers twisted as if someone, or something, had been lying there. But it wasn't the bed that made my breath catch. It was the writing on the walls. Scrawled in what looked like blood were words, over and over, "Leave now, leave now, leave now." My legs moved before my brain could catch up. I ran down the stairs, grabbed my bag, and bolted for the car. Salem hissed as I scooped him up, but I didn't care. I threw him into the passenger seat, started the engine, and sped down the gravel driveway. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house stood there, dark and silent, but I swear I saw something, or someone, standing in the upstairs window, watching me leave. Rachel called me the next day, furious that I'd left the house in such a hurry. I told her what had happened, about the knocking, the footsteps, the writing. She went quiet for a long moment before saying, "You saw the writing?" "Yes," I said. "What the hell, Rachel? What's going on in that house?" She hung up. I never got an explanation, and I haven't spoken to Rachel since. A few months ago, I heard through a mutual friend that she and her husband had moved out of the farmhouse. They said it was because of a mold issue, but I know the truth. Whatever's in that house doesn't want visitors. And it doesn't knock to be polite. It knocks to warn you. It began with the voicemail. "Hey, just wanted to check in. Haven't heard from you in a while. Call me back, okay?" There was nothing strange about it, except I didn't recognize the voice. The number was blocked, and the message had no timestamp. I assumed it was meant for someone else, a wrong number, and deleted it. But the voice stuck with me, soft, familiar in a way I couldn't quite place. The next day, there was another voicemail. "Hey, it's me again. Are you okay? I'm starting to get worried. Call me." Again, no number, no timestamp, just that voice. I checked my call log, but there was no record of an incoming call. My phone hadn't even rung. I shrugged it off, assuming it was a glitch, but something about the tone of the voice, warm, insistent, made me uneasy, like whoever it was knew me better than I wanted to admit. That night, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating. Groggy, I grabbed it from the nightstand. No missed calls. No notifications. But when I unlocked the screen, the voicemail app opened on its own. There was a new message. Why aren't you answering? I'm trying to help you. You're in danger. Please, pick up. This time, there was something in the voice, an edge of desperation that sent a shiver down my spine. I replayed it twice, trying to make sense of it. The voice was calm but urgent, and for some reason, it made my stomach churn. I tried calling the blocked number back, but of course, there was nothing to call. I deleted the message, turned my phone off, and went back to sleep. The dream started that night. I was standing on a road that stretched endlessly in both directions. The asphalt was cracked and overgrown with weeds, and the sky above was a pale, featureless gray. A figure stood in the distance, too far away to make out any details. As I approached, they turned to face me. Their mouth opened, but no sound came out. I woke up gasping, the details already slipping away, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was familiar. The voicemails continued over the next week. I don't have much time. They're coming for you. I can't keep you safe if you don't listen. You need to leave. They know where you are. Each time, the voice grew more urgent, more strained, as if the speaker was running out of time. I started avoiding my phone, letting it sit on the counter while I paced the apartment, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. Who was calling me? How did they know me? And what the hell did they mean by danger? On the 7th day, I came home from work to find my apartment door unlocked. I froze, my keys dangling from my hand. I knew I'd locked it before I left. I always double-checked. My first thought was that someone had broken in, but nothing was missing. The only thing out of place was my phone, sitting in the middle of the kitchen table. The screen was on, displaying the voicemail app. There was a new message. This one was different. Turn around. My blood ran cold. I didn't move. My breath came in shallow bursts as I stared at the phone, my mind screaming at me to run, to leave, to do anything but what the message said. Then I heard it, a soft creak, like a footstep on the floorboards behind me. Slowly, I turned. The room was empty, but the air felt wrong, heavier somehow, and there was a faint smell of burning metal. My hands shook as I grabbed my phone and bolted from the apartment, not stopping until I was halfway down the block. I didn't go back that night. Instead, I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town, trying to convince myself it was all some elaborate prank. But when I turned on my phone, there was another message waiting. You can't run. They're already here. That night, the dreams returned. I was back on the endless road, but this time, the figure was closer. Close enough that I could make out the details of their face. It was me. My doppelganger stared at me with empty eyes, their lips moving soundlessly. Then they raised a hand and pointed behind me. I turned, and the sky cracked open. I woke up screaming, the sound echoing in the small motel room. My phone was vibrating on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with a new message. This time, I didn't listen to it. I smashed the phone against the wall, over and over, until it was nothing but shattered glass and twisted metal. For the first time in days, the room was silent. I thought it was over, until I heard the motel phone ring. The sound was jarring, shrill, cutting through the quiet like a knife. I stared at it, paralyzed, as it rang again and again. Finally, I picked it up. Hello? The line crackled with static. Then the voice came through, clearer than ever. You can't stop it. You were warned. The line went dead. I haven't slept since. Everywhere I go, I hear it. My name, whispered in the hum of streetlights, in the rustle of leaves, in the hiss of static from the motel TV. I don't know what's coming for me, but I know it's close. And I know there's nowhere left to run. The first time I noticed the staircase, I thought I was losing my mind. It wasn't supposed to be there. My house, a modest 2-story Victorian, had exactly one staircase, a creaky set of wooden steps leading to the second floor. But that morning, as I carried a load of laundry down to the basement, I found another staircase. It was tucked into the far corner of the basement, just past the old water heater. Narrow and steep, its steps were made of a dark, polished wood that didn't match anything else in the house. The walls around it were smooth and seamless, painted in a shade of black so deep it seemed to absorb light. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it, laundry forgotten in my arms. I didn't remember ever seeing it before. Hell, I didn't remember the corner being big enough to fit a staircase. Against my better judgment, I took a step closer. The air near the stairs was colder, heavy with a faint metallic tang that made the back of my throat itch. I reached out to touch the banister, a smooth, black rail that felt unnaturally warm under my fingers. A shiver ran through me, and I pulled my hand back. My phone buzzed in my pocket, jolting me out of whatever trance the stairs had put me in. It was a text from my friend Sarah, asking if I wanted to grab lunch. I glanced back at the staircase, then at the laundry still piled in my arms. I left. For the rest of the day, I tried to convince myself I'd imagined it. A trick of the light. Maybe I was just tired. But when I went back down to the basement that evening, the staircase was still there, looming in the corner like it had always been. That night, I dreamed of it. In the dream, I was standing at the top of the stairs, looking down into an endless void. The steps seemed to go on forever, spiraling into darkness, and a low hum vibrated through the air, so deep it rattled my bones. I couldn't see where it led, but I felt it calling to me, pulling me closer with every beat of my heart. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The next morning, I tried to ignore it. I went about my day, avoided the basement, and told myself it wasn't my problem. But the dreams kept coming. Every night, I stood at the top of those stairs, staring down into the void. Every night, the pull grew stronger. By the end of the week, I couldn't take it anymore. I went down to the basement with a flashlight and a crowbar, determined to figure out what the hell was going on. The staircase was waiting for me, its polished wood gleaming in the faint light. I set the flashlight on a shelf, its beam aimed at the steps, and tapped the crowbar against the wall beside it. The wall was solid, smooth concrete, cold and unyielding. But when I pressed the crowbar against the stairs, they gave slightly, like they weren't entirely real. The surface rippled faintly under the metal, and I could feel something. Movement, maybe, just beneath it. My heart pounded in my chest, and for a moment, I thought about running back upstairs and forgetting the whole thing. But the pull was too strong. I dropped the crowbar, grabbed the flashlight, and stepped onto the first stair. It was warm. I took another step, then another, the hum growing louder with every movement. The air around me grew colder, the metallic tang sharp enough to make my eyes water. I should have turned back. I should have run, but I didn't. The basement disappeared behind me, swallowed by the darkness. The stairs seemed endless. My flashlight barely cut through the gloom, its beam swallowed by the void. I lost track of how long I'd been walking. Minutes, hours, days? The hum had grown into a roar, vibrating through my chest, shaking the stairs beneath my feet. And then, suddenly, the staircase ended. I stepped onto a smooth, black surface, my flashlight revealing a vast, featureless plain that stretched out in every direction. The air was freezing, the metallic smell replaced by something worse, something sour and decayed. I turned in a slow circle, my breath fogging in the cold. That's when I saw it. A figure stood in the distance, tall and thin, its body wrapped in tattered fabric that fluttered in an unseen wind. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its gaze, heavy and unrelenting, pressing down on me like a physical weight. It didn't move, but the air around it seemed to ripple, distorting the space like heat waves on asphalt. The hum stopped. In the silence, the figure raised one hand, pointing directly at me. Its fingers were long and spindly, too many joints bending at unnatural angles. A voice echoed through the void. Not words, exactly, but a deep, resonant sound that I could feel in my bones. I turned and ran. The stairs stretched on forever, the hum returning, louder and more frantic. I didn't look back. I couldn't. My legs burned, my lungs screamed, but I kept moving, the sound of footsteps, its footsteps, echoing behind me. When I finally burst into the basement, the stairs were gone. The corner was empty, just cracked concrete and peeling paint. My flashlight flickered and died in my hand, and I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. I don't sleep anymore. Not because of the dreams, they've stopped, but because I can still feel it watching me, waiting. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the hum. It's faint, distant, but it's there, and I know the stairs will come back. They showed up on my doorstep one morning in a vase as plain as the sky before a storm. No card, no note, just a dozen pale blue tulips. I didn't think much of it at first. I figured someone had sent them to the wrong address, or that one of my coworkers had decided to thank me anonymously for picking up their slack. Still, they were beautiful in a strange way. The kind of blue you don't normally see in nature, almost otherworldly. I brought them inside and set them on my kitchen counter. By the second day, I noticed something odd. The flowers didn't wilt, the petals didn't droop, and the stems didn't sag. They looked just as fresh and vibrant as they had when I found them. I told myself it was a good thing, less maintenance for me, but a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling that it was unnatural. On the third day, I woke up to find them in a different spot. I'd left them on the counter before I went to bed, but when I came downstairs, they were on the dining table. Maisie, my cat, was sitting on a chair, staring at the vase like it might move. Her tail swished back and forth, her ears flat against her head. I frowned and picked her up, stroking her fur to calm her down. "Weird cat," I muttered. "It's just flowers." But they weren't just flowers. That night, I had the first dream. In the dream, I was standing in a field of blue tulips that stretched as far as the eye could see. The sky above was dark and roiling, filled with low, heavy clouds that seemed to hum with tension. The air smelled sweet, but not in a comforting way. It was cloying, suffocating. I tried to move, but my feet were rooted to the ground. Then I heard it, a voice, faint at first but growing louder, a sing-song whisper that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. "They're watching," it said. "They're waiting." When I woke up, I was gasping for air, the taste of the dream still clinging to the back of my throat. I stumbled out of bed and headed for the kitchen, half expecting to find the flowers on the floor or scattered across the counter. But they were still in the vase, still on the dining table, their petals as perfect as ever. I told myself I was overreacting. It was just a dream, and flowers couldn't move. But then I noticed something that made my stomach turn. The vase wasn't empty. The water inside had turned dark, almost black, and there were tiny things floating in it. Specks that looked like ash or dirt, but moved like they were alive. I grabbed the vase, intending to dump it down the sink. But the moment my hands touched the glass, I felt a sharp, electric jolt shoot up my arm. I dropped it with a gasp, and the vase shattered on the floor, water spilling everywhere. The tulips didn't fall. They stayed upright, standing in a perfect cluster as if the vase had never been there. And as I stared at them, I swear I saw the petals shift, just slightly, like they were breathing. I didn't know what to do. My brain scrambled for logic, for a reason, but there was nothing. No explanation that made sense. So I grabbed a garbage bag, scooped up the flowers, and threw them outside. I watched from the window as the trash collector came later that afternoon, taking the bag and its contents far, far away. That night, I slept better. No dreams. No whispers. For the first time in days, the house felt normal again. Until I woke up. The flowers were back. This time, they weren't on the counter or the dining table. They were in my bedroom, sitting on the nightstand next to my bed. The vase was whole again, filled with that same dark water. The flowers looked wrong now. The blue was deeper, richer, almost glowing, and the petals had started to curl at the edges, like they were reaching for something. For me, I didn't bother with garbage bags this time. I grabbed the vase and drove straight to the nearest park, dumping the flowers into a pond and watching as they sank beneath the surface. I stood there for a long time, staring at the ripples on the water, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The air was still. The world was quiet. I drove home, feeling foolish, relieved. The next morning, they were in the hallway. I didn't touch them this time. I didn't go near them. I just stared, my chest tight, my heart pounding. The flowers were changing. The stems were longer now, twisting and gnarled like vines, and the petals were so dark they looked black in the dim light. Maisie hissed at them, her fur standing on end, and bolted upstairs. That night, the dreams came back. This time, I wasn't alone in the field. There were figures standing among the tulips, their shapes barely visible in the gloom. They were tall and thin, their faces shadowed, their movements slow and deliberate. They didn't speak, but I felt their presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. One of them turned toward me, and though I couldn't see its eyes, I knew it was watching. "They're waiting." The whisper came again, louder now, almost mocking. "You invited them." I woke up to find the flowers in my bed. The petals were brushing against my arm, cold and damp, and the vase was gone. The stems were tangled together now, their edges sharp like thorns. I scrambled out of bed, shaking, and grabbed the first thing I could find. A pair of scissors. I hacked at the flowers, cutting them into pieces, and threw the remains into the fireplace. The flames flared bright blue for a moment, then went out. The house is different now. It's quiet, but not in a peaceful way. The air feels thick, heavy, like I'm not alone. I see things out of the corner of my eye. Shadows that move when they shouldn't, figures that vanish when I turn my head. Maisie won't come near me anymore. She hides upstairs, her eyes wide, her tail tucked between her legs. The flowers are gone, but I can still hear them. At night, when the house is dark, the whispers come back. They're here. It began when I got the email. I was working late one night, the office silent except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights. I was about to pack up when my computer dinged. A new message in my inbox? The sender's address was a jumble of numbers and letters, like someone had smashed their keyboard. The subject line simply read, "Your file is ready." I hesitated, my cursor hovering over the message. Against my better judgment, I clicked it. The email contained only a single link and a line of text, "Download to begin." I knew better than to click random links from unknown senders. But something about it was compelling. It wasn't curiosity, exactly. It was more like an itch in my brain, a tug I couldn't ignore. Before I knew it, I was clicking the link. The file downloaded instantly, a small folder titled Helix.exe. I opened it, expecting, I don't know, a virus, maybe? But instead, my screen went black. For a moment, I thought my computer had crashed, but then a single line of white text appeared. "Would you like to see?" A yes/no prompt blinked below it. Every rational part of me screamed to close the window, to unplug my computer and walk away. But my hand moved on its own, the mouse drifting to yes and clicking. The screen flickered, and then I saw it. A live video feed. The camera was in a dark room, illuminated by the faint, cold glow of a single fluorescent bulb. At first, I couldn't make out much, just rows of shelves crammed with objects. Books, jars, tools, things I couldn't identify. The feed panned slowly, almost lazily, until it stopped on a table in the center of the room. On the table was a photo. It was me. The image wasn't a selfie or something I'd posted online. It was a candid shot, taken from an angle that made it clear I hadn't known I was being photographed. I was sitting at my desk in the office, wearing the same clothes I had on right now. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart hammering. The room was deathly silent except for my ragged breathing. I grabbed my bag and bolted, not even bothering to turn off the lights. When I got home, my laptop was on my kitchen counter. That shouldn't have been possible. I'd left it at the office. But there it was, the screen glowing faintly. I opened it cautiously, and the live feed resumed automatically, as if I'd never shut it. This time, the camera was in a hallway. The walls were concrete, unpainted, the kind of place you'd find in an industrial basement or a bunker. The camera moved slowly, passing doors marked with faded numbers. I couldn't tell what I was looking at until it stopped at a door labeled Room 7. The feed cut to black. I should have thrown the laptop out the window, but instead, I sat there, staring at the blank screen. That's when the message popped up. "Would you like to find Room 7? Another yes/no prompt. My hand trembled as I clicked yes. The screen filled with text, an address, coordinates, and a time. 11:47 p.m. My stomach twisted. The address was only a few blocks from my apartment. I don't know why I went. Maybe it was morbid curiosity. Maybe it was that same itch in my brain. But at 11:30, I found myself standing outside an old, decrepit building. The windows were boarded up, the walls tagged with layers of graffiti. The front door was ajar, creaking faintly in the breeze. Inside, the air was damp and smelled of mildew. My footsteps echoed as I made my way down a narrow corridor. The faint sound of dripping water came from somewhere in the distance. I followed the hall, my phone flashlight cutting through the dark until I reached a door. It was marked Room 7. The door was unlocked. Inside was the room from the video feed. The shelves, the table, the fluorescent bulb, all exactly as I'd seen them. But the photo of me was gone. In its place was something else. A box. It was small, made of dark, polished wood, with a faintly glowing emblem carved into the lid. A spiral, tight and endless. I approached cautiously, my hands shaking as I lifted the lid. Inside was a tape recorder. The moment I touched it, the bulb above me flickered violently, casting the room into alternating shadows and light. The tape recorder clicked on by itself, and a voice crackled through the speaker. "It knows you're here." The bulb exploded, plunging the room into darkness. I grabbed my phone, my flashlight illuminating the space just enough to see the door. I bolted, the recorder still clutched in my hand. When I made it back to my apartment, I locked every door and window, my heart still racing. The tape recorder sat on my coffee table, silent now, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. At 3 a.m., my laptop screen lit up. The live feed was back. The camera was in my apartment now, the angle perfectly capturing me sitting on the couch. My breath hitched as the camera began to pan, slowly turning toward the hallway that led to my bedroom. At the end of the hall stood a figure. It was barely more than a shadow, tall and motionless, but as the camera lingered, I could make out its face, or what should have been a face. There were no features, just smooth, dark skin that reflected the light faintly. The laptop screen flickered again, the figure vanishing as another message appeared. "It's already inside. I haven't left my apartment since." The tape recorder clicks on sometimes, whispering things I can't quite hear. The laptop turns itself on, showing me glimpses of places I don't recognize but feel like I should. And at night, I hear footsteps in the hallway. Closer, every time. I was brushing my teeth, the hum of the electric toothbrush filling the small bathroom, when I noticed it. A fine, spidery crack, running diagonally across the bottom corner of the mirror above the sink. I frowned, leaning closer. It hadn't been there this morning. I was sure of it. The glass was smooth, pristine, like always. But now, the crack caught the light in a way that made it seem almost alive, glinting faintly as if it had just been made. With a sigh, I made a mental note to replace the mirror and went to bed, forgetting about it entirely. The next morning, the crack was gone. Not repaired. Not there at all. The glass was flawless, reflecting my tired face and the faint sunlight streaming through the bathroom window. For a second, I thought maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was overtired, or catching the start of a migraine. But I couldn't shake the memory of how it had glinted, how it had seemed almost to shimmer as though it had been waiting to be noticed. I didn't give it much thought after that, until the following night. I'd been working late, my eyes aching from hours of staring at my computer. When I stepped into the bathroom, everything was normal at first. I splashed water on my face, yawned, and then glanced up at the mirror. The crack was back, but it wasn't in the corner anymore. It had moved. This time, it stretched across the middle of the mirror, jagged and sharp, as though someone had dragged a knife across the glass. My heart skipped a beat. I leaned in closer, my breath fogging the surface. The crack wasn't just a flaw in the glass. It had depth, almost like a rift, as if the mirror were a window, and beyond the crack, there was something else. I reached out to touch it. My fingertips brushed the surface, and for a split second, I felt resistance. Like the glass wasn't cold and solid, but pliable, like the surface of a pond. I snatched my hand back, staring at my reflection. And then, for the briefest moment, the reflection wasn't mine. It was me, but not me. The same face, the same hair, but the eyes, they were wrong. Darker, sharper, filled with something I couldn't name. The other me smiled, slow and deliberate, and then the crack was gone again. The mirror was smooth, ordinary, reflecting only my wide-eyed, pale face. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, the crack came and went, always appearing in a new place, always sharper, more intricate. It began to form patterns, loops, spirals, symbols that seemed deliberate, as though the mirror were trying to tell me something. I started avoiding the bathroom altogether, brushing my teeth in the kitchen sink, shaving without looking too closely at my reflection. But it wasn't just the mirror anymore. The first time I noticed it, I was walking past a shop window on my way to work. My reflection lagged behind, just for a second, like it was reluctant to leave. Another time, I caught a glimpse of myself in the glossy surface of a car door and saw that same smile, the too wide, too knowing grin of the thing I'd seen in the mirror. I tried to ignore it. I told myself I was overworked, stressed, imagining things. But the cracks started appearing elsewhere. In the reflection of my phone screen, in the surface of my coffee table, once, even in the sheen of a puddle after a rainstorm. And every time, they seemed to grow larger, more intricate, more alive. I decided I needed help. I called a friend, Anna, someone grounded, rational, someone who wouldn't brush me off as crazy. She came over that evening, and I told her everything. She didn't laugh. She didn't scoff. She just listened, her brow furrowed in concern. "Show me," she said finally. I took her to the bathroom. The mirror was pristine, as always when I tried to prove something was wrong. "It's not always there," I admitted, feeling foolish, "but it's real. I swear it is." Anna leaned closer, examining the glass. "It looks fine," she said. Then, with a small, uncertain laugh, "Maybe it's stress, you know? Like, when you're tired and you think you see shadows moving?" "I'm not imagining this," I said, more forcefully than I intended. She gave me a look, sympathetic but doubtful, and turned to leave. The crack appeared. It stretched across the mirror, jagged and pulsing faintly with light. Anna froze. "What the?" She reached out, her fingers hovering just above the glass. "Is this some kind of—" Her hand touched it, and the world shifted. The room darkened, the air thick with a heavy, electric tension. The crack widened, the glass splitting apart like a mouth opening. On the other side was darkness, deep, infinite, alive. And from that darkness, something moved. A hand emerged first, pale and impossibly long, its fingers bending at unnatural angles. Then came the rest of it, limbs too long, skin too smooth, a face that wasn't a face at all. It didn't climb out of the mirror. It flowed, like liquid taking shape, its movements slow and deliberate. Anna screamed, stumbling back, but the thing didn't look at her. It looked at me. It tilted its head, the gesture almost curious, and then it smiled. The same smile I'd seen in the mirror, the same too wide grin. Its form shimmered, and for a moment, it looked exactly like me. "You invited me," it said, its voice soft, almost gentle. "You kept looking." "I didn't." My voice caught in my throat. "I didn't mean to." "But you did." It stepped closer, and the room seemed to warp around it, the edges of reality bending and curling. "And now it's time." Anna grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the door. "We have to go," she shouted. But as we turned, we found ourselves back in the bathroom, the mirror in front of us, the cracks spreading across every surface. There was no escape. The last thing I saw before the glass shattered completely was my own reflection, smiling back at me. And then everything went dark. I found the house by accident. It wasn't on the map, and it wasn't supposed to be there. I was driving home after a long hike in the mountains, exhausted and slightly lost. My phone had no signal, and the GPS had given up hours ago. The winding back roads all looked the same, lined with skeletal trees that seemed to close in tighter as the sun dipped lower in the sky. That's when I saw it. A narrow gravel driveway cutting through the trees, leading to a small, weathered house with a sagging porch. There was no mailbox, no sign, no indication that it belonged to anyone. But I was desperate. My gas gauge was on empty, and the idea of spending the night stranded on a deserted road made my stomach churn. The house felt wrong even before I knocked. The windows were dark, but I thought I saw a faint flicker of movement behind the curtains. The air was heavy and still, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I hesitated, then raised my hand and knocked 3 times. The door creaked open almost immediately, though no one was there. "Hello?" I called, stepping inside. The interior smelled faintly of wood smoke and something metallic, like old pennies. The furniture was simple and sparse. A worn couch, a small table, a rocking chair that swayed slightly, though there was no breeze. I almost left right then, but before I could turn back, I saw a single lit candle on the table. Next to it was a handwritten note. "Stay the night. It's safer here." Safer than what? I turned to leave, but the door was gone. Where there had been a solid wooden door leading back to the porch, there was now only a wall. My chest tightened as I ran my hands over the smooth surface, searching for a seam, a hinge, anything. It was as though the door had never existed. The house was quiet, too quiet. Even the creak of the rocking chair had stopped. I fumbled for my phone, desperate to call someone, anyone, but the screen was black. No power, no signal. The candle flickered on the table, its flame unnaturally steady despite my frantic movements. And then I heard it, a faint scratching sound coming from upstairs. It was slow, deliberate, like nails dragging against wood. I froze, straining to hear more, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. "Hello?" I called again, my voice trembling. "Is someone there?" Silence. I thought about staying downstairs, but the scratching started again, louder this time. Whatever was up there, it wasn't waiting for me to come to it. The staircase groaned under my weight as I climbed, the wood soft and worn. At the top, there was a single hallway with 3 doors. The scratching was coming from the one at the far end, the paint peeling and warped as if it had absorbed too much moisture. I approached cautiously, my hand trembling as I reached for the knob. The air grew colder with each step, my breath fogging in front of me. I opened the door slowly, the hinges whining in protest. The room was empty, just a plain wooden floor, bare walls, and a single window that overlooked nothing but darkness. The scratching sound had stopped, but when I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me and the room changed. The walls were no longer bare. They were covered in photographs, hundreds of them, pinned and taped and overlapping in chaotic patterns. My stomach dropped as I realized they were all of me. Pictures from different stages of my life, childhood birthday parties, high school graduation, random snapshots I didn't even remember taking. Some were recent, showing me in places I'd been just days ago. But the worst ones were from moments I hadn't lived yet. There was a photo of me standing in this room, staring at the walls, the same panicked expression frozen on my face. And then, in the far corner of the room, something moved. It wasn't a person. It wasn't even a shape I could define. It was like a shadow, but darker, its edges flickering like smoke. It slid across the wall, passing through the photographs without disturbing them, and stopped just a few feet away from me. A voice filled the room, low and echoing, as if it came from the walls themselves. "You shouldn't have knocked." I backed into the corner, my hands scraping against the rough wood. "What do you want?" I managed to whisper. The shadow twisted, its form shifting and elongating. It didn't have eyes, but I could feel it looking at me. "You invited yourself in," it said. "Now you're part of it." Part of what? The shadow didn't answer. Instead, it pointed, or something like pointing, at the photographs on the wall. I followed its gesture, and my eyes landed on a picture near the center of the collage. It showed me sitting in the rocking chair downstairs, a blank expression on my face. The shadow was behind me, its smoky tendrils wrapping around my shoulders like a puppeteer. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "That's not real. That hasn't happened." The shadow moved closer, and the room seemed to fold in on itself, the walls warping and closing the distance between us. "When you leave," the voice said, "you'll forget. They always forget." I didn't know what it meant, but I didn't wait to find out. I ran for the door, throwing it open and barreling down the stairs. The house seemed to twist as I moved, the room shifting and stretching like a nightmare. When I reached the front door, it was there again, solid and waiting. I flung it open and stumbled outside. The gravel driveway was gone. The house stood in the middle of a dense forest, the trees crowding around it like sentinels. I didn't look back. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the wet ground. When I finally found the road, my car was waiting, engine cold, as if no time had passed at all. I drove all night, not stopping until I reached home. But the memory of the house lingers, vivid and inescapable. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I see that photograph again. The one of me in the rocking chair, the shadows tendrils curling around me. I haven't gone back, but deep down, I know I'm still part of it. I'd been living in the house for a month before I noticed it. It was one of those older homes, the kind that looks charming at first but quickly reveals its quirks. Drafty windows, creaky floors, pipes that groan like they're alive. I was renting it for cheap while I worked on a writing project, something I'd convinced myself needed solitude and isolation. The door was in the basement. I hadn't spent much time down there. It was cold, smelled faintly of mildew, and felt oddly oppressive. But that day, I'd gone down to look for a breaker box after a fuse blew. The space was mostly empty, just a few cardboard boxes left behind by the previous tenant, and a washer-dryer combo that looked older than me. And then I saw it. A door in the far corner of the basement, set into the concrete wall. It wasn't like the other doors in the house. It was smaller, maybe 4 feet high, and made of dark, heavy wood. There was no handle, only a rusted keyhole set into a tarnished brass plate. I frowned. How had I not noticed this before? Curiosity got the better of me, and I crouched in front of it, running my fingers over the rough wood. The edges of the door were sealed tight, as if it had been built into the wall rather than added later. I knocked on it once, lightly. The sound didn't echo. It was like the door absorbed the noise. I tried to pull it open, but it wouldn't budge. No handle, no hinges visible on this side. It was just there. Back upstairs, I called the landlord. "Oh, that," he said when I asked about the door. "Yeah, don't worry about it. It's been sealed up for years. Just leave it alone." Sealed up? What's behind it? Nothing. Just part of the old foundation or something. Honestly, I forgot it was even there. His tone was dismissive, but something about it struck me as off. He sounded too quick to brush it aside, too eager to change the subject. I should have left it alone. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The door felt wrong, out of place, like it didn't belong in this world. By the third day, I couldn't stand it anymore. I bought a flashlight and a set of lock-picking tools online, telling myself I'd just take a peek. When the tools arrived, I waited until late at night to try them out. I didn't want to explain myself to anyone, especially not the landlord. The basement felt colder than usual as I knelt in front of the door, the air heavy and damp. It took longer than I expected to jimmy the lock. The tumblers were old and resistant, but eventually, I felt a satisfying click. The door swung open on its own, slowly and silently. The space beyond was dark, pitch black, like the light from my flashlight couldn't penetrate it. I stepped closer, my stomach twisting with unease. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding strange in the confined space. Nothing. I shone the flashlight inside. The beam caught a set of stairs leading downward, carved from rough stone. The walls were damp and uneven, and the air that wafted up smelled ancient, like earth and decay. I should have stopped there. I should have closed the door, locked it, and gone upstairs. But I didn't. I stepped inside. The stairs spiraled downward, deeper than they had any right to go. The walls pressed closer the further I descended, and the air grew colder with every step. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I was plunged into darkness. When the light came back, I was standing at the bottom of the stairs. The space was massive, far larger than the footprint of the house above. The floor was packed dirt, and the walls were lined with strange, jagged symbols carved into the stone. They seemed to shift when I looked at them, like they were alive. In the center of the room was a stone table. It was stained dark, and I didn't want to think about what had caused the stains. But the worst part was the sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. A faint whispering, barely audible, like someone speaking from the far side of a closed door. It wasn't coming from anywhere specific. It was everywhere, filling the air around me. I backed away, my heart pounding, but my foot caught on something, and I fell hard onto the dirt. The flashlight flew from my hand, spinning wildly. For a brief second, its beam illuminated something in the corner of the room. A figure. It was hunched, its back to me, its limbs too long and thin. Its skin was gray, mottled, stretched too tight over its bones. It twitched, a sudden, jerky motion that sent me scrambling backward. The whispers grew louder. The figure turned its head slowly, too slowly, as if it wasn't used to the motion. Its face was wrong. Hollow. The eyes were sunken pits, the mouth too wide, filled with jagged, blackened teeth. And it was smiling. I don't know how I got out of there. One moment, I was staring at it, frozen in terror, and the next, I was upstairs, slamming the basement door shut behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I didn't eat. I just sat on the couch, clutching the flashlight, waiting for the whispers to start again. They did. I could hear them through the floor, faint but insistent. And every so often, I heard something else. A creak of wood. The soft scrape of nails against the basement door. I left the house the next morning, packed a bag and drove without looking back. I called the landlord from a motel and told him I wasn't coming back. He didn't sound surprised. "You opened it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. I didn't answer. He sighed. "You should have left it alone." I hung up. That was weeks ago. I've tried to move on, but I can't. The whispers followed me. At night, I hear them in the walls, in the corners of my room, growing louder every day. And I know it's only a matter of time before it finds me. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was in line at the pharmacy. It was the usual afternoon chaos. People shuffling impatiently, heads buried in their phones, the smell of floor cleaner mingling with the faint scent of cologne and someone's too strong takeout. I was staring at the digital screen displaying ticket numbers when I felt it, a tugging sensation in the back of my mind, like the faint memory of a name I couldn't place. I turned to look behind me, but there was nothing there. Just a middle-aged woman in a plaid coat checking her watch. Then I glanced back at the screen, and my number had changed. Not advanced, just changed. It wasn't the number I'd taken from the machine. It wasn't even in the same sequence. It was now 01, glowing faintly in bright green letters. The pharmacy wasn't empty, though. It was crowded, so 01 didn't make sense. I stared at it, then looked down at the paper slip in my hand. It still said 67. I didn't have time to think about it because the clerk called my original number, snapping me out of my trance. By the time I grabbed my prescription and stepped outside, the memory of the glitch felt like a blur. A quirk of the system, maybe. Something I could shake off. The second time, it was my cat. Jinx had always been predictable. Sleeping in the same spot on the couch, batting at the same corner of the rug every evening. But that night, as I was scrolling through my phone, I looked up and saw her sitting at the foot of the hallway. Her eyes were fixed on me, unblinking, her tail curled neatly around her paws. At first, I thought nothing of it. Cat stare, after all. But the way she sat was wrong. Too still, too rigid, like a statue. I called her name. Jinx. Her head tilted, almost human-like, and then she stood and walked away. Only, she didn't walk. She moved, but her legs didn't bend. It was as if she were gliding, her paws not quite touching the ground. A chill ran down my spine. I got up, following her into the kitchen. She wasn't there. I checked the living room, the bathroom, the entire apartment. No sign of her. Then I turned back toward the couch, and there she was, lying exactly where she'd been, curled up and purring softly. It didn't make sense. I told myself I'd imagined it, that I was tired, overthinking. But that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Jinx had been replaced, or that something had borrowed her for just a moment. Things escalated after that. The next morning, I poured myself a bowl of cereal and nearly dropped the box when I saw the milk. The carton sat on the counter, perfectly still, but the liquid inside wasn't. It churned and bubbled violently, as though it were boiling, despite being ice cold to the touch. I stared at it, feeling a growing sense of dread, before finally dumping it down the sink. The milk gurgled as it went down the drain, and for a split second, I thought I heard it laugh. I stopped eating breakfast after that. The world around me began to twist in subtle, maddening ways. On my walk to work, I passed the same man twice. Same suit, same tie, same briefcase. The first time, he nodded politely as we passed each other. The second time, he smiled, his teeth unnaturally white, his eyes wide and unblinking. At the office, my computer started glitching. My emails would rewrite themselves in real time, words rearranging to form cryptic messages. Do you feel it yet? Something is watching. When I tried to show my coworker, the screen went back to normal. She laughed it off, told me I needed a vacation. I began keeping track of the strangeness in a journal, desperate to make sense of it all. But even that betrayed me. One morning, I opened the notebook to find pages I hadn't written, entire entries in someone else's handwriting. They described things I hadn't seen, hadn't experienced. The sky split open today. I saw the other side. They're getting closer. I tore those pages out and burned them, but new ones kept appearing, creeping into the blank spaces like mold. Then, the whispers began. At first, I thought they were dreams, soft voices murmuring just as I drifted off to sleep. But then they came when I was awake, too. Always faint, just on the edge of hearing. Do you see the cracks? They asked. What cracks? I whispered back one night, sitting alone in the dark. The voices didn't answer, but the next day, I saw them. Tiny fissures in the air, like fractures in glass, spreading across the edges of my vision. I tried to touch one, and the world flickered. For a split second, everything around me changed. My apartment became something else entirely, a vast, empty expanse filled with towering structures of light and shadow. And then it was gone, and I was back on my couch, trembling. The cracks grew larger, more frequent. The sky outside my window looked wrong, its clouds moving too quickly, bending in impossible directions. People on the street moved in perfect sync, their heads turning toward me as I passed. Even Jinx began acting stranger, sitting in front of the door and growling at nothing. One night, the whispers turned into a voice, clear, steady, and calm. You've been noticed, it said. They're coming. Who's coming? I asked, clutching the journal to my chest. The lights in my apartment flickered. The air grew cold. The ones who watch, the voice replied. Before I could respond, the knock came. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly loud. It rattled the doorframe, the walls, the very air around me. Jinx hissed, her fur bristling as she bolted under the couch. I didn't move. The knock came again. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything but sit there frozen in fear. The knob twisted, and the door creaked open, revealing nothing but darkness on the other side. A figure stepped through, tall, impossibly thin, its face obscured by a shifting mass of static. It didn't speak, but I felt its presence like a weight pressing down on my chest. You've been marked, the voice said again, though the figure's mouth didn't move. For what? I managed to choke out. To hold the cracks, it replied, or to fall through them. Before I could respond, the figure raised a hand, and the world shattered like glass. Now, I don't know where I am. The sky is dark, but not with night, just endless, empty black. The ground beneath me shifts like sand, and the cracks are everywhere, pulsing faintly with light. I hear whispers in the distance, growing louder, closer. I think they're waiting for me to decide, to fix this place, or to let it break completely. I was sitting in my living room, scrolling mindlessly through my phone, when it buzzed with a call from an unrecognized number. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. Maybe it was boredom, or maybe it was the feeling that the night was just too quiet. Hello? I said, expecting silence or some scammer trying to sell me solar panels. Instead, a voice crackled through, faint but clear. It was a woman, and she sounded frantic. It's me, she said. Listen, there's not much time. Whatever you do, don't go outside. Do you hear me? I blinked, confused. I think you have the wrong number. No, I don't, she snapped. I don't have time to explain. Just don't go outside. And then she hung up. I stared at my phone, the screen fading back to my home screen. The call lasted only 15 seconds, just enough time to leave me thoroughly unsettled. For a moment, I thought about brushing it off. Wrong numbers happen all the time, but something about her voice, the urgency in it, gnawed at me. I got up and went to the window, peering out into the street below. It was late, past midnight, and the neighborhood was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, you'd hear a dog barking, a car passing, maybe the hum of someone's TV. But tonight, it was dead silent. Even the air seemed unnaturally still. And then I saw it. At first, it looked like a shadow, a dark figure standing on the sidewalk across the street. It wasn't moving, just standing there, perfectly still. My first thought was that it was a neighbor, but there was something wrong with the way it stood. Too straight, too rigid, like a mannequin left in the middle of the street. I squinted, trying to make out more details, but the figure was shrouded in darkness. Then, as if sensing my gaze, it turned its head toward me. Even from this distance, I felt it. Its eyes locked on mine, a weighty, oppressive stare that made my chest tighten. I stepped back from the window, my heart racing. Maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe it was a trick of the light or some weird shadow cast by the street lamp. But then my phone buzzed again. The same number. My thumb hesitated over the screen before I answered. "Hello?" "I told you not to look," the woman said, her voice low and trembling. "You've seen it now. It knows." "Knows what?" I demanded. "What the hell is going on?" She didn't answer directly. "Close the blinds. Lock the doors. Stay where you are. It can't come in unless you let it." "What can't come in?" But the line went dead again. I stood there, phone in hand, my thoughts a chaotic mess. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, to write it off as some bizarre prank. But the other part, the part that remembered the way that shadow had turned its head, couldn't shake the creeping sense of dread. I went back to the window, my hand hovering over the blinds. Slowly, I peeked out again. The figure was closer now. It was standing in the middle of the street, directly under the street lamp. The light cast harsh shadows across its form, and for the first time, I could make out its features. Except there were none. No face, no eyes, no mouth. Just a smooth, featureless surface where a face should have been. I slammed the blinds shut and stumbled back, my chest heaving. My phone buzzed again, but this time it wasn't a call. It was a text. "You looked again. It's coming." I dropped the phone and bolted to the front door, checking the lock. My hands were shaking as I turned the deadbolt, double-checking every window and door in the house. The silence outside was suffocating now, pressing in from every corner. I grabbed a kitchen knife. Not that I thought it would do much against whatever it was. The power went out. The house plunged into darkness, and for a moment, all I could hear was the sound of my own breathing. Then came the knock. 3 sharp, deliberate raps on the front door. I froze, the knife clutched in my hand. The knock came again, louder this time. Whoever, or whatever, was on the other side wasn't leaving. I moved toward the door, every step feeling like it took an eternity. My hand hovered over the peephole. "Don't look," I thought, but I couldn't help myself. I peeked through. The peephole distorted the image, but I could see enough. The figure was standing on my porch now, its featureless face inches from the door. It didn't move, didn't knock again. It just stood there, waiting, and then it tilted its head, as if it knew I was watching. I stumbled back, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. The phone buzzed on the floor, lighting up with another message. "Don't let it in, no matter what it says." The knocking started again, more frantic now, as if it could sense my fear. And then a voice, low, distorted, but unmistakably human. "Let me in," it said. "Please, I need help." It sounded like me. My blood ran cold. The voice was identical to mine, down to the trembling edge of panic. It knocked again. "Let me in. I'm hurt." I backed away, clutching the knife. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, to do anything but open that door. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. "Let me in." And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence was worse than the knocking. I stood there, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something, anything, to happen. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Finally, I forced myself to move, to peek out the window one last time. The street was empty. The figure was gone, and the neighborhood looked normal again. But I didn't feel relieved. I felt watched. The next morning, I found a package on my doorstep. No return address, no markings. Just a plain, black box with a note taped to the top. Next time, don't answer. It was the smell that woke me. Sharp, acrid, like something burning but not quite fire. Something chemical, industrial. My apartment was pitch black, and for a moment, I thought I was dreaming. But the smell was real, and it was getting stronger. I stumbled out of bed, half blind in the dark, and flicked on the light. Nothing was burning. The stove was off. No smoke, no glowing wires. Just that smell, saturating the air. It made my eyes water, and I gagged as I moved through the apartment, trying to find the source. The windows were shut tight, the locks on the doors still latched. Nothing out of place. But the smell wasn't going away. It was getting worse. I cracked open a window to let in some air, and that's when I saw them. Outside, on the street below, they stood in clusters, scattered like weeds through the darkness. Pale, too pale, their skin almost luminous under the dim streetlights. They weren't moving, just standing there, looking up, looking at me. There were at least a dozen of them, their heads tilted back, their faces blank and featureless. No eyes, no mouths, just smooth, waxy skin where their features should have been. My stomach turned, and I slammed the window shut so hard the glass rattled. I called 911. The line rang and rang, no answer. I tried again. Nothing. The emergency line wasn't even supposed to ring like that, was it? It should have connected immediately. The third time, it didn't ring at all, just a dead silence, like the phone wasn't even working. The smell was stronger now, almost suffocating. My chest felt tight, and my head swam. I leaned against the counter, trying to breathe, when I heard the sound. A low, rhythmic tapping. It wasn't coming from the window, though. I would have expected that, terrifying as it would have been. It was coming from inside the apartment. Tap, tap, tap. I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. It led me to the bathroom door, which was closed. I hadn't closed it. I never closed it when I was alone. The tapping stopped. Hello? My voice sounded small, ridiculous. But what else was I supposed to say? I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling, and slowly pushed it open. The bathroom was empty, but the mirror wasn't right. At first, I couldn't place it. The reflection showed the bathroom exactly as it should have been. The white sink, the chipped tile, the shower curtain half pulled aside. But then I realized it wasn't reflecting me. The room was empty in the mirror, too, except for something small and dark moving in the corner. A shape, shadowy and indistinct, that shouldn't have been there. I slammed the door shut and backed away, nearly tripping over the edge of the rug. The smell was unbearable now, thick and choking, and my skin felt damp with sweat or something worse. I grabbed my phone, desperate to try another number, any number, when I noticed the notification on the screen. One new voicemail. I hadn't heard it ring. I hadn't heard anything. My thumb hovered over the screen, but I couldn't bring myself to open it. Not yet. Instead, I backed into the living room, keeping my eyes on the bathroom door, half expecting it to open. And then, something moved behind me. I spun around, phone still clutched in my hand, but the room was empty. The lights flickered, dimming for a moment before returning to full brightness. I stared at the window, at the street below. The pale figures were gone. The voicemail icon blinked on my phone screen, waiting. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I pressed play. The message was static at first, faint and crackling, like a distant radio signal. Then came the voice, low and distorted, barely more than a whisper. "They're inside," it said. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and then the lights went out. The darkness was complete, a thick, suffocating void that swallowed the room. My phone screen was the only source of light, casting a faint glow that barely reached the edges of the couch. My fingers fumbled to turn on the flashlight, but as the beam of light cut through the dark, I realized I wasn't alone. Something stood in the corner of the room. It wasn't one of the figures from outside. This was something else. Something worse. Its outline was jagged, wrong, like a glitch in reality, its body flickering in and out of focus. It didn't move, but I felt it watching me, the air around it thick and humming with a low, static buzz. I backed away slowly, the flashlight trembling in my hand. The thing in the corner didn't follow, but as I turned toward the door, I heard the tapping again. Louder this time, faster. It wasn't coming from the bathroom anymore. It was coming from the walls, from inside the walls. The sound grew, spreading, multiplying, until it surrounded me, the rhythmic tapping blending into a cacophony of scratching and thudding. The walls seemed to pulse, the air vibrating with an energy that made my teeth ache. My phone buzzed in my hand. One new message. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to see. But my thumb moved on its own, opening the text. It was a picture of me, sitting on the floor, the flashlight in my hand, the walls behind me warped and bulging, and in the corner of the room, where the thing had been standing, there was nothing but empty space. The tapping stopped. The smell was gone. The lights flickered back on. For a moment, everything seemed normal. The apartment was quiet, the air clean and still. But when I glanced at the mirror on the wall, I saw something else. It wasn't my reflection. It was standing behind me, watching.